Chapter 16. The Diamond Hoard. As the primitive smoke bombs filled the throne room of the Tower of the Emperors with their suffocating fumes, the Gomangani clustered about Tarzan, begging him to save them, for they too had seen the masked Bolgani before every entrance and the great body of them that awaited in the gardens and upon the terrace without. "Wait a minute," said Tarzan, "until the smoke is thick enough to hide our movements from the Bolgani, and then we will rush the windows overlooking the terrace, for they are nearer the east gate than any other exit, and thus some of us will have a better chance for escape." "I have a better plan," said the old man. "When the smoke conceals us, follow me. There is one exit that is unguarded, probably because they do not dream that we would use it. When I passed over the dais behind the throne, I took occasion to note that there were no Bolgani guarding it." "Where does it lead?" asked Tarzan. "Into the basement of the Tower of Diamonds, the tower in which I discovered you. That portion of the palace is nearest to the east gate, and if we can reach it before they suspect our purpose, there will be little doubt that we can reach the forest at least." "Splendid," ejaculated the ape-man. "It will not be long now before the smoke hides us from the Bolgani." In fact, it was so thick by this time that the occupants of the throne room were finding difficulty in breathing. Many of them were coughing and choking, and the eyes of all were watering from the effects of the acrid smoke. And yet they were not entirely hidden from the observation of the watchers all about them. "I don't know how much more of this we can stand," said Tarzan. "I have about all I care for now." "It is thickening up a bit," said the old man. "Just a moment more, and I think we can make it unseen." "I can stand it no longer," cried Ale. "I am suffocating and I am half-blinded." "Very well," said the old man. "I doubt if they can see us now. It is pretty thick. Come, follow me," and he led the way up the steps of the dais and through an aperture behind the thrones, a small opening hidden by hangings. The old man went first, and then Ella, followed by Tarzan and Jadbalya, who had about reached the limit of his endurance and patience, so that it had been with difficulty that Tarzan had restrained him, and who now was voicing his anger in deep growls which might have apprised the Bolgani of their avenue of escape. Behind Tarzan and the lion crowded the coughing Gomangani, but because Jadbalja was just in front of them, they did not crowd as closely upon the party ahead of them as they probably would have done otherwise. The aperture opened into a dark corridor, which led down a flight of rough steps to a lower level, and then straight through utter darkness for the rather considerable distance which separated the Tower of Diamonds from the Tower of the Emperors. So great was their relief at escaping the dense smoke of the throne room that none of the party minded the darkness of the corridor, but followed patiently the lead of the old man, who had explained that the first stairs down which they had passed were the only obstacles to be encountered in the tunnel. At the corridor's end, the old man halted before a heavy door, which after considerable difficulty he managed to open. "Wait a moment," he said, "until I find a cresset and make a light." They heard him moving about beyond the doorway for a moment, and then a dim light flared, and presently the wick in a cresset flickered. In the dim rays, Tarzan saw before them a large rectangular chamber, the great size of which was only partially suggested in the wavering light of the cresset. "Get them all in," said the old man, and closed the door, and when that had been done, he called to Tarzan. "Come," he said, "before we leave this chamber I want to show you such a sight as no other human eyes have ever rested upon." He led him to the far side of the chamber where, in the light of the cresset, Tarzan saw tier after tier of shelves, upon which were stacked small sacks made of skins. The old man set the cresset upon one of the shelves, and taking a sack opened it and spilled a portion of the contents into the palm of his hand. "Diamonds," he said. "Each of these packages weighs 5 pounds and each contains diamonds. They have been accumulating them for countless ages, for they mine far more than they can use themselves. In their legends is the belief that someday the Atlanteans will return and they can sell the diamonds to them, and so they continue to mine them and store them as though there was a constant and ready market for them. Here, take one of the bags with you," he said. He handed one to Tarzan and another to La. "I do not believe that we shall ever leave the valley alive, but we might," and he took a third bag for himself. From the diamond vault, the old man led them up a primitive ladder to the floor above, and quickly to the main entrance of the tower. Only 2 heavy doors, bolted upon the inside, now lay between them and the terrace, a short distance beyond which the east gate swung open. The old man was about to open the doors when Tarzan stopped him. "Wait a moment," he said, "until the rest of the Gomangani come. It takes them some time to ascend the ladder." When they are all here behind us, swing the doors open, and you and LA with this 10 or a dozen Gomangani that are immediately around us, make a break for the gate. The rest of us will bring up the rear and hold the Bolgani off in case they attack us. Get ready, he added a moment later. I think they are all up. Carefully, Tarzan explained to the Gomangani the plan he had in mind, and then, turning to the old man, he commanded. Now the bolts slipped, the doors swung open, and simultaneously the entire party started at a run toward the east gate. The Bolgani, who were still massed about the throne room, were not aware that their victims had eluded them until Tarzan, bringing up the rear with Jad Balja, was passing through the east gate. Then the Bolgani discovered him and immediately set up a hue and cry that brought several hundred of them on a mad run in pursuit. Here they come, cried Tarzan to the others. Make a run of it straight down the valley toward Opar La. And you, demanded the young woman. I shall remain a moment with the Gomangani and attempt to punish these fellows. La stopped in her tracks. I shall not go a step without you, Tarzan of the Apes, she said. Too great already are the risks you have taken for me. No, I shall not go without you. The ape man shrugged. As you will, he said. Here they come. With great difficulty he rallied a portion of the Gomangani who once through the gate seemed imbued but with a single purpose, and that to put as much distance between the Palace of Diamonds and themselves as possible. Perhaps 50 warriors rallied to his call, and with these he stood in the gateway toward which several hundred Bolgani were now charging. The old man came and touched Tarzan on the arm. You had better fly, he said. The Gomangani will break and run at the first assault. We will gain nothing by flying, said Tarzan, for we should only lose what we have gained with the Gomangani, and then we should have the whole valley about us like hornets. He had scarcely finished speaking when one of the Gomangani cried, Look! Look! They come, and pointed along the trail into the forest. And just in time, too, remarked Tarzan as he saw the first of a swarm of Gomangani pouring out of the forest toward the east gate. Come, he cried to the advancing blacks, the Bolgani are upon us. Come and avenge your wrongs. Then he turned, and calling to the blacks around him, leaped forward to meet the onrushing guerrilla men. Behind them, wave after wave of Gomangani rolled through the east gate of the Palace of Diamonds, carrying everything before them to break at last like surf upon the wavering wall of Bolgani that was being relentlessly hurled back against the palace walls. The shouting and the fighting and the blood worked Jad Balja into such a frenzy of excitement that Tarzan with difficulty restrained him from springing upon friend and foe alike, with the result that it required so much of the ape-man's time to hold in leash his ferocious ally that he was able to take but little part in the battle. Yet he saw that it was going his way, and that, but for the occurrence of some untoward event, the complete defeat of the Bolgani was assured. Nor were his deductions erroneous. So frantic were the Gomangani with the bloodlust of revenge, and so enthused by the first fruits of victory that they went fully as mad as Jad Balja himself. They neither gave nor asked quarter, and the fighting ended only when they could find no more Bolgani to slay. The fighting over, Tarzan, with Lay and the old man, returned to the throne room from which the fumes of the smoke bombs had now disappeared, and to them they summoned the headman of each village, and when they had assembled before the dais, above which stood the three whites, with the great black men lion Jad Balja, Tarzan addressed them. Gomangani of the Valley of the Palace of Diamonds, he said, you have this night won your freedom from the tyrannical masters that have oppressed you since far beyond the time the oldest of you may remember. For so many countless ages have you been oppressed that there has never developed among you a leader capable of ruling you wisely and justly. Therefore you must select a ruler from another race than your own. You cried voice after voice as the headmen clamored to make Tarzan of the Apes their king. No, cried the ape man, holding up his hand for silence, but there is one here who has lived long among you and who knows your habits and your customs, your hopes and your needs better than any other. If he will stay with you and rule you, he will, I am sure, make you a good king. And Tarzan pointed to the old man. The old man looked at Tarzan in bewilderment. But I want to go away from here, he said. I want to get back into the world of civilization from which I have been buried all these years. You do not know what you are talking about, replied the ape man. You have been gone very long. You will find no friends left back there from whence you came. You will find deceit and hypocrisy and greed and avarice and cruelty. You will find that no one will be interested in you and that you will be interested in you. And have left my jungle and gone to the cities built by men, but always I have been disgusted and been glad to return to my jungle, to the noble beasts that are honest in their loves and in their hates, to the freedom and genuineness of nature. If you return, you will be disappointed, and you will realize that you have thrown away an opportunity of accomplishing a work well worth your while. These poor creatures need you. I cannot remain to guide them out of darkness, but you may, and you may so mold them that they will be an industrious, virtuous, and kindly people, not untrained, however, in the arts of warfare, for when we have that which is good, there will always be those who are envious and who, if they are more powerful than we, will attempt to come and take what we have by force. Therefore, you must train your people to protect their country and their rights, and to protect them they must have the ability and the knowledge to fight successfully, and the weapons wherewith to wage their wars. You speak the truth, Tarzan of the Apes, replied the old man. There is nothing for me in that other world, so if the Gomangani wish me to be their chief, I will remain here. The headmen, when he questioned them, assured Tarzan that if they could not have him for chief, they would be very glad to have the old man, whom they all knew, either by sight or reputation, as one who had never perpetrated any cruelties upon the Gomangani. The few surviving Bolgani who had taken refuge in various parts of the palace were sought out and brought to the throne room. Here they were given the option of remaining in the valley as slaves or leaving the country entirely. The Gomangani would have fallen upon them and slain them, but that their new king would not permit. But where shall we go if we leave the valley of the Palace of Diamonds? Asked one of the Bolgani. Beyond the city of Opar we know not what exists, and in Opar may we find only enemies. Tarzan sat eyeing them quizzically and in silence. For a long time he did not speak, while several of the Gomangani headmen and others of the Bolgani made suggestions for the future of the gorilla men. Finally the ape man arose and nodded toward the Bolgani. There are about 100 of you, he said. You are powerful creatures and should be ferocious fighters. Beside me sits Alay, the high priestess and queen of Opar. A wicked priest, usurping her power, has driven her from her throne, but tomorrow we march upon Opar with the bravest Gomangani of the valley of the Palace of Diamonds. And there we punish Kadjay, the high priest, who has proven a traitor to his queen in LA, once more ascends the throne of Opar. But where the seeds of treason have once been broadcast, the plant may spring up at any time, and where least expected, it will be long, therefore. Before La of Opar may have full confidence in the loyalty of her people, a fact which offers you an opportunity in a country. Accompany us, therefore, to Opar and fight with us to replace La upon her throne, and then when the fighting is over, remain there as La's bodyguard to protect her. Not only from enemies without, but from enemies within. The Bolgani discussed the matter for several minutes, and then one of them came to Tarzan. We will do as you suggest, he said. And you will be loyal to La? Asked the ape man. A Bolgani is never a traitor, replied the gorilla man. Good, exclaimed Tarzan, and you, La, are you satisfied with this arrangement? I accept them in my service, replied she. Early the next morning Tarzan and Lay set out with 3,000 Gomangani and 100 Bolgani to punish the traitorous Kadjay. There was little or no attempt at strategy or deception. They simply marched down through the valley of the Palace of Diamonds, descended the rocky ravine into the valley of Opar, and made straight for the rear of the Palace of A. A little grey monkey sitting among the vines and creepers upon the top of the temple walls saw them coming. He cocked his head first upon one side and then upon the other, and became so interested and excited that for a moment he forgot to scratch his belly, an occupation he had been assiduously pursuing for some time. The closer the column approached, the more excited became Manu, the monkey, and when he realized vaguely the great numbers of the Gomangani, he was fairly beside himself. But the last straw that sent him scampering madly back to the Palace of Opar was the sight of the Bolgani, the ogres of his little world. Kadjay was in the courtyard of the inner temple, where at sunrise he had performed a sacrifice to the flaming god. With Kadjay were a number of the lesser priests and Oa and her priestesses. That there was dissension among them was evident by the scowling faces fully as much as by the words which Oa directed at Kadjay. Once again have you gone too far, Kadjay, she cried bitterly. Only may the high priestess of the flaming god perform the act of sacrifice. Yet again and again do you persist in defiling the sacred knife with your unworthy hand. Silence, woman, growled the high priest. I am Kadjay, king of Opar, high priest of the flaming god. You are what you are only because of the favor of Kadjay. Try not my patience too far, or you shall indeed know the feel of the sacred knife. There could be no mistaking the sinister menace in his words. Several of those about him could ill conceal the shocked surprise they felt at his sacrilegious attitude toward their high priestess. However little they thought of Oa, the fact remained that she had been elevated to the highest place among them, and those that believed that Leia was dead, as Kadje had taken great pains to lead them all to believe, gave in full to Oa the reverence which her high office entitled her to. "Have a care," Kadje warned one of the older priests. "There is a limit beyond which not even you may pass." "You dare threaten me," cried Kadje, the maniacal fury of fanaticism gleaming in his eyes. "You dare threaten me, Kadje, the high priest of the flaming god." And as he spoke, he leaped toward the offending man, the sacrificial knife raised menacingly above his head, and just at that moment a little grey monkey came chattering and screaming through an embrasure in the wall, overlooking the court of the temple. "The Bolgani! The Bolgani!" he shrieked. "They come! They come!" Kadje stopped and wheeled toward Manu, the hand that held the knife dropping at his side. "You saw them, Manu?" he asked. "You are speaking the truth. If this is another of your tricks, you will not live to play another joke upon Kadje." "I speak the truth," chattered the little monkey. "I saw them with my own eyes." "How many of them are there?" asked Kadje. "And how near to Opar have they come?" "They are as many as the leaves upon the trees," replied Manu, "and they are already close to the temple wall, the Bolgani and the Gomangani. They come as the grasses that grow in the ravines where it is cool and damp." Kadje turned and raised his face toward the sun, and throwing back his head gave voice to a long-drawn scream that ended in a piercing shriek. 3 times he voiced the hideous cry, and then with a command to the others in the court to follow him, he started at a brisk trot toward the palace proper. As Kadje directed his steps toward the ancient avenue, upon which the palace of Opar faced, there issued from every corridor and doorway groups of the knurled and hairy men of Opar, armed with their heavy bludgeons and their knives. Screaming and chattering in the trees above them were a score or more of little grey monkeys. "Not here," they cried, "not here," and pointed toward the south side of the city. Like an undisciplined mob, the horde of priests and warriors re-entered the palace at Kadje's heels and retraced their steps toward the opposite side of the edifice. Here they scrambled to the summit of the lofty wall which guards the palace, just as Tarzan's forces came to a halt outside. "Rocks! Rocks!" screamed Kadje, and in answer to his commands the women in the courtyard below commenced to gather the loose fragments of stone that had crumbled from the wall and from the palace, and to toss them up to the warriors above. "Go away," screamed Kadje to the army outside his gates. "Go away, I am Kadje, high priest of the flaming god, and this is his temple. Defile not the temple of the flaming god, or you shall know his wrath." Tarzan stepped forward a little ahead of the others, and raised his hand for silence. "La, your high priestess and your queen, is here," he cried to the Oparians upon the wall. "Kadje is a traitor and an impostor. Open your gates and receive your queen. Give up the traitors to justice, and no harm will befall you, but refuse lay entry to her city, and we shall take by force and with bloodshed that which belongs to La rightfully." As he ceased speaking, La stepped to his side that all her people might see her, and immediately there were scattering cries for La and a voice or two raised against Kadje. Evidently realizing that it would not take much to turn the scale against him, Kadje shrieked to his men to attack, and simultaneously launched a stone at Tarzan. Only the wondrous agility that he possessed saved the ape-man, and the missile passed by, and striking a Gomangani over the heart, felled him. Instantly a shower of missiles fell upon them, and then Tarzan called to his followers to charge. Roaring and growling, the Bolgani and the Gomangani leaped forward to the attack. Cat-like they ran up the rough wall in the face of the menacing bludgeons above. Tarzan, who had chosen Kadje as his objective, was among the first to reach the summit. A hairy, crooked warrior struck at him with a bludgeon, and hanging to the summit of the wall with one hand, Tarzan caught the weapon in the other and wrested it from his assailant. At the same time, he saw Kadje turn and disappear into the courtyard beyond. Then Tarzan drew himself to the top, where he was immediately engaged by 2 other warriors of Opar. With the weapon he had wrested from their fellow, he knocked them to right and left, so great an advantage his great height and strength gave him over them, and then remembering only that Kadje, who was the ringleader of the revolt against La, must not be permitted to escape, Tarzan leaped to the pavement below, just as the high priest disappeared through an archway at the opposite end of the courtyard. Some priests and priestesses sought to impede his progress. Seizing one of the former by the ankles, he swung the body in circles about him, clearing his own pathway as he ran for the opposite end of the courtyard, and there he halted and wheeled, and putting all the strength of his great muscles into the effort. He swung the body of the priest once more and hurled it back into the faces of his pursuers. Without waiting to note the effect of his act, he turned again and continued in pursuit of Kadje. The fellow kept always just ahead of him, because Kaji knew his way through the labyrinthian mazes of the palace and temple and courtyards better than Tarzan. That the trail was leading toward the inner courts of the temple, Tarzan was convinced. There Kaji would find easy ingress to the pits beneath the palace, and a hiding place from which it would be difficult to dislodge him, so numerous and winding were the dark subterranean tunnels. And so Tarzan put forth every effort to reach the sacrificial court in time to prevent Kaji from gaining the comparative safety of the underground passages, but as he finally leaped through the doorway into the court, a noose, cunningly laid, closed about one of his ankles, and he was hurled heavily to the ground. Almost instantly a number of the crooked little men of Opar leaped upon him, where he lay half-stunned by the fall, and before he had fully regained his faculties they had trussed him securely. Only about half-conscious he felt them raise him from the ground and carry him, and presently he was deposited upon a cold stone surface. Then it was that full consciousness returned to him, and he realized that he lay outstretched once more upon the sacrificial altar of the inner court of the temple of the flaming god, and above him stood Kaji, the high priest, his cruel face contorted in a grimace of hate and the anticipation of revenge long deferred. At last gloated the creature of hate. This time, Tarzan of the apes, you shall know the fury not of the flaming god, but of Kaji, the man, nor shall there be any weight, nor any interference. He swung the sacrificial knife high above his head. Beyond the point of the knife, Tarzan of the apes saw the summit of the courtyard wall, and just surmounting it the head and shoulders of a mighty, black-maned lion. "Jad Baljah," he cried. "Kill! Kill!" Kaji hesitated, his knife poised on high. He saw the direction of the ape-man's eyes and followed them, and in that instant the golden lion leaped to the pavement, and with two mighty bounds was upon the high priest of Opar. The knife clattered to the floor, and the great jaws closed upon the horrid face. The lesser priests who had seized Tarzan, and who had remained to witness his death at the hands of Kaji, had fled screaming from the court the instant that the golden lion had leaped upon their master. And now Tarzan and Jad Baljah and the corpse of Kaji were the sole occupants of the sacrificial courtyard of the temple. "Come," Jad Baljah commanded Tarzan, "let no one harm Tarzan of the apes." An hour later the victorious forces of Lay were overrunning the ancient palace and temples of Opar. The priests and warriors who had not been killed had quickly surrendered and acknowledged Lay as their queen and high priestess, and now at Lay's command the city was being searched for Tarzan and Kaji. It was thus that Lay herself, leading a searching party, entered the sacrificial courtyard. The sight that met her eyes brought her to a sudden halt, for there, bound upon the altar, lay Tarzan of the apes, and standing above him, his snarling face and gleaming eyes glaring directly at her, was Jad Baljah, the golden lion. Tarzan shrieked to Lay, taking a step toward the altar. "Kaji has had his way at last. God of my fathers, have pity on me, Tarzan is dead." "No," cried the ape-man, "far from dead. Come and release me. I am only bound, but had it not been for Jad Baljah, had been dead beneath your sacrificial knife." "Thank God," cried Lay, and started to approach the altar, but paused before the menacing attitude of the growling lion. "Down," cried Tarzan. Let her approach, and Jad Baljah lay down beside his master and stretched his whiskered chin across the ape-man's breast. Lay came then, and picking up the sacrificial knife, cut the bonds that held the Lord of the Jungle captive, and then she saw beyond the altar the corpse of Kaji. "Your worst enemy is dead," said Tarzan, "and for his death you may thank Jad Baljah, as I thank him for my life. You should rule now in peace and happiness, and in friendship with the people of the Valley of the Palace of Diamonds." That night Tarzan and the Bogani and the headmen of the Gomangani and the priests and priestesses of Opar sat in the great banquet hall of the Palace of Opar as the guests of La, the queen, and ate from the golden platters of the ancient Atlanteans, platters that had been fashioned on a continent that exists today only in the legends of antiquity. And the following morning Tarzan and Jad Baljah set forth upon their return journey to the land of the Wazirian home. Chapter 17. The Torture of Fire. Flora Hawks and her 4 confederates, pursued by Luvini and his 200 warriors, stumbled through the darkness of the jungle night. They had no objective, for, guided entirely as they had been by the blacks, they knew not where they were and were completely lost. The sole idea dominating the mind of each was to put as much distance between themselves and the camp of the Ivory Raiders as possible, for no matter what the outcome of the battle there might have been, their fate would be the same should the victorious party capture them. They had stumbled on for perhaps half an hour when, during a momentary rest, they heard plainly behind them the sound of pursuit, and again they plunged on in their aimless flight of terror. Presently, to their surprise, they discerned the glow of a light ahead. What could it be? Had they made a complete circle, and was this again the camp they had been fleeing? They pushed on to reconnoiter until at last they saw before them the outlines of a camp surrounded by a thorn boma, in the center of which was burning a small campfire. About the fire were congregated 100 black warriors, and as the fugitives crept closer they saw among the blacks a figure standing out clearly in the light of the campfire, a white woman, and behind them rose louder and louder the sound of pursuit. From the gestures and gesticulations of the blacks around the campfire, it was evident that they were discussing the sounds of the battle they had recently heard in the direction of the raiders' camp, for they often pointed in that direction. And now the woman raised her hand for silence, and they all listened, and it was evident that they too heard the coming of the warriors who were pursuing Flora Hawkes and her confederates. "There is a white woman there," said Flora to the others. "We do not know who she is, but she is our only hope, for those who are pursuing us will overtake us quickly. Perhaps this woman will protect us. Come, I am going to find out." And without waiting for an answer, she walked boldly toward the boma. They had come but a short distance when the keen eyes of the Waziri discovered them, and instantly the boma wall was ringed with bristling spears. "Stop," cried one of the warriors. "We are the Waziri of Tarzan. Who are you?" "I am an Englishwoman," called Flora in reply. "I and my companions are lost in the jungle. We have been betrayed by our safari. Our headman is pursuing us now with warriors. There are but 5 of us, and we ask your protection." "Let them come," said Jane to the Waziri. As Flora Hawkes and the 4 men entered the boma beneath the scrutiny of Jane Clayton and the Waziri, another pair of eyes watched from the foliage of the great tree that overhung the camp upon the opposite side, grey eyes to which a strange light came as they recognized the girl and her companions. As the newcomers approached Lady Greystoke, the latter gave an exclamation of surprise. "Flora," she exclaimed in astonishment. "Flora Hawkes, what in the world are you doing here?" The girl, startled too, came to a full stop. "Lady Greystoke," she ejaculated. "I do not understand," continued Lady Greystoke. "I did not know that you were in Africa." For a moment the glib Flora was overcome by consternation, but presently her native wit came to her assistance. "I am here with Mr. Bloober and his friends," she said, "who came to make scientific researches and brought me along because I had been to Africa with you and Lord Greystoke and knew something of the manners and customs of the country, and now our boys have turned against us, and unless you can help us we are lost." "Are they West Coast boys?" asked Jane. "Yes," replied Flora. "I think my Waziri can handle them." "How many of them are there?" "About 200, said Krasky. Lady Greystoke shook her head. "The odds are pretty heavy," she commented, and then she called to Ursula, who was in charge. "There are 200 West Coast boys coming after these people," she said. "We shall have to fight to defend them." "We are Waziri," replied Ursula, simply, and a moment later the van of Louvini's forces broke into view at the outer rim of the campfire's reach. At sight of the glistening warriors ready to receive them, the West Coast boys halted. Louvini, taking in the inferior numbers of the enemy at a glance, stepped forward a few paces ahead of his men and commenced to shout taunts and insults, demanding the return of the whites to him. He accompanied his words with fantastic and grotesque steps, at the same time waving his rifle and shaking his fist. Presently his followers took up the refrain until the whole band of 200 was shrieking and yelling and threatening, the while they leaped up and down as they worked themselves into a frenzy of excitement that would impart to them the courage necessary for the initiating of a charge. The Waziri, behind the boma wall, schooled and disciplined by Tarzan of the Apes, had long since discarded the fantastic overture to battle so dear to the hearts of other warlike tribes, and instead stood stolid and grim awaiting the coming of the foe. "They have a number of rifles," commented Lady Greystoke. "That looks rather bad for us." "There are not over 6 who can hit anything with their rifles," said Krasky. "You men are all armed. Take your places among my Waziri. Warn your men to go away and leave us alone. Do not fire until they attack, but at the first overt act commence firing. And keep it up. There is nothing that so discourages a West Coast black as the rifle fire of white men. Flora and I will remain at the back of the camp, near that large tree." She spoke authoritatively, as one who is accustomed to command and knows whereof she speaks. The men obeyed her, even Bloober, though he trembled pitiably as he moved forward to take his place in the front ranks among the Waziri. Their movements in the light of the campfire were all plainly discernible to Louvini, and also to that other who watched from the foliage of the tree beneath which Jane Clayton and Flora Hawkes took refuge. Louvini had not come to fight. He had come to capture Flora Hawkes. He turned to his men. "There are only 50 of them," he said. "We can kill them easily, but we did not come to make war. We came to get the white girl back again. Stay here and make a great show against those sons of jackals. Keep them always looking at you. Advance a little and then fall back again. And while you are thus keeping their attention attracted in this direction, I will take 50 men and go to the rear of their camp and get the white girl. And when I have her, I will send word to you, and immediately you can return to the village, where, behind the palisade, we shall be safe against attack." Now this plan well suited the West Coast blacks, who had no stomach for the battle looming so imminent, and so they danced and yelled and menaced more vociferously than before, for they felt they were doing it all with perfect impunity, since presently they should retire, after a bloodless victory, to the safety of their palisade. As Louvini, making a detour, crept through the concealment of the dense jungles to the rear of the camp, while the din of the West Coast blacks arose to almost deafening proportions, there dropped suddenly to the ground before the two white women from the tree above them, the figure of a white giant. Naked except for loincloth and leopard skin, his godlike contour picked out by the flickering light of the beast fire. "John," exclaimed Lady Greystoke, "thank God it is you." "SSS," cautioned the white giant, placing a forefinger to his lips, and then suddenly he wheeled upon Flora Hawkes. "It is you I want," he cried, and seizing the girl he threw her lightly across his shoulders, and before Lady Greystoke could interfere, before she half realized what had occurred, he had lightly leaped the protecting boma in the rear of the camp and disappeared into the jungle beyond. For a moment Jane Clayton stood reeling as one stunned by an unexpected blow, and then, with a stifled moan, she sank sobbing to the ground, her face buried in her arms. It was thus that Louvini and his warriors found her as they crept stealthily over the boma and into the camp in the rear of the defenders upon the opposite side of the beast fire. They had come for a white woman, and they had found one, and roughly dragging her to her feet, smothering her cries with rough and filthy palms, they bore her out into the jungle toward the palisaded village of the Ivory Raiders. 10 minutes later, the white men and the Waziri saw the West Coast blacks retire slowly into the jungle, still yelling and threatening, as though bent on the total annihilation of their enemies. The battle was over without a shot fired or a spear hurled. "Blime," said Throck, "what was all the bloomin' fuss about anyhow? I thought they was going to heat Huss up, and the blighters never done nothing but yell, and 'ere we are, and that's that." The Jew swelled out his chest. "It takes more as a bunch of niggers to bluff Adolph Bluber," he said pompously. Krasky looked after the departing blacks and then, scratching his head, turned back toward the campfire. "I can't understand it," he said, and then suddenly, "Where are Flora and Lady Greystoke?" It was then that they discovered that the two women were missing. The Waziri were frantic. They called the name of their mistress aloud, but there was no reply. "Come," cried Yusula, "we the Waziri shall fight." After all, and running to the boma he leaped it, and followed by his 50 blacks, set out in pursuit of the West Coast boys. It was but a moment or two before they overtook them, and that which ensued resembled more a rout than a battle. Fleeing in terror toward their palisade with the Waziri at their heels, the West Coast blacks threw away their rifles that they might run the faster. But Louvini and his party had had sufficient start so that they were able to reach the village and gain the safety of the palisade before pursued and pursuers reached it. Once inside the gate, the defenders made a stand, for they realized that if the Waziri entered, they should all be massacred, and so they fought as a cornered rat will fight, with the result that they managed to hold off the attackers until they could close and bar the gate. Built as it had been as a defense against far greater numbers, the village was easy to defend, for there were less than 50 Waziri now, and nearly 200 fighting men within the village to defend it against them. Realizing the futility of blind attack, Yusula withdrew his forces a short distance from the palisade, and there they squatted, their fierce, scowling faces glaring at the gateway, while Yusula pondered schemes for outwitting the enemy, which he realized he could not overcome by force alone. "It is only Lady Greystoke that we want," he said. "Vengeance can wait until another day." "But we do not even know that she is within the village," reminded one of his men. "Where else could she be?" then asked Yusula. "It is true that you may be right, she may not be within the village, but that I intend to find out. I have a plan, See, the wind is from the opposite side of the village. 10 of you will accompany me, the others will advance again before the gate and make much noise, and pretend that you are about to attack. After a while the gate will open and they will come out. And that I promise you. I will try to be here before that happens, but if I am not, divide into 2 parties and stand upon either side of the gateway and let the West Coast blacks escape. We do not care for them. Watch only for Lady Greystoke, and when you see her, take her away from those who guard her. Do you understand? His companions nodded. Then come, he said, and selecting 10 men disappeared into the jungle. Louvini had carried Jane Clayton to a hut not far from the gateway to the village. Here he had bound her securely and tied her to a stake, still believing that she was Flora Hawkes, and then he had left her to hurry back toward the gate that he might take command of his forces in defense of the village. So rapidly had the events of the past hour transpired that Jane Clayton was still half-dazed from the series of shocks that she had been called upon to endure. Dwarfing to nothingness the menace of her present position was the remembrance that her Tarzan had deserted her in her hour of need and carried off into the jungle another woman. Not even the remembrance of what Ursula had told her concerning the accident that Tarzan had sustained, and which had supposedly again affected his memory, could reconcile her to the brutality of his desertion, and now she lay, face down, in the filth of the Arab hut, sobbing as she had not for many years. As she lay there torn by grief, Ursula and his 10 crept stealthily and silently around the outside of the palisade to the rear of the village. Here they found great quantities of dead brush left from the clearing which the Arabs had made when constructing their village. This they brought and piled along the palisade, close against it, until nearly 3/4 of the palisade upon that side of the village was banked high with it. Finding that it was difficult to prosecute their work in silence, Ursula dispatched one of his men to the main body upon the opposite side of the village, with instructions that they were to keep up a continuous din of shouting to drown the sound of the operations of their fellows. The plan worked to perfection, yet even though it permitted Ursula and his companions to labor with redoubled efforts, it was more than an hour before the brush pile was disposed to his satisfaction. Louvini, from an aperture in the palisade, watched the main body of the Waziri, who were now revealed by the rising of the moon, and finally he came to the conclusion that they did not intend to attack that night, and therefore he might relax his watchfulness and utilize the time in another and more agreeable manner. Instructing the bulk of his warriors to remain near the gate and ever upon the alert, with orders that he be summoned the moment that the Waziri showed any change in attitude, Louvini repaired to the hut in which he had left Lady Greystoke. The black was a huge fellow with low, receding forehead and prognathous jaw, a type of the lowest form of African Negro. As he entered the hut with a lighted torch which he stuck in the floor, his bloodshot eyes gazed greedily at the still form of the woman lying prone before him. He licked his thick lips and, coming closer, reached out and touched her. Jane Clayton looked up and, recoiling in revulsion, shrank away. At sight of the woman's face, the black looked his surprise. "Who are you?" he demanded in the pidgin English of the coast. "I am Lady Greystoke, wife of Tarzan of the Apes," replied Jane Clayton. "If you are wise, you will release me at once." Surprise and terror showed in the eyes of Louvini, and another emotion as well, but which would dominate the muddy brain it was difficult, then, to tell. For a long time he sat gazing at her, and slowly the greedy, gloating expression upon his face dominated and expunged the fear that had at first been written there, and in the change Jane Clayton read her doom. With fumbling fingers, Louvini untied the knots of the bonds that held Jane Clayton's wrists and ankles. She felt his hot breath upon her and saw his bloodshot eyes and the red tongue that momentarily licked the thick lips. The instant that she felt the last thong with which she was tied fall away, she leaped to her feet and sprang for the entrance to the hut. But a great hand reached forth and seized her, and as Louvini dragged her back toward him, she wheeled like a mad tigress and struck repeatedly at his grinning, ugly face. By brute force, ruthless and indomitable, he beat down her weak resistance and slowly and surely dragged her closer to him. Oblivious to aught else, deaf to the cries of the Waziri before the gate, and to the sudden new commotion that arose in the village, the two struggled on, the woman, from the first, foredoomed to defeat. Against the rear palisade, Ursula had already put burning torches to his brush pile at 6 different places. The flames, fanned by a gentle jungle breeze, had leapt almost immediately into a roaring conflagration, before which the dry wood of the palisade crumbled in a shower of ruddy sparks which the wind carried to the thatched roofs of the huts beyond, until in an incredibly short period of time the village was a roaring inferno of flames. And even as Yusula had predicted, the gates swung open and the West Coast blacks swarmed forth in terror toward the jungle. Upon either side of the gateway the Waziri stood, looking for their mistress, but though they waited and watched in silence until no more came from the gateway of the village, and until the interior of the palisade was a seething hell of fire, they saw nothing of her. Long after they were convinced that no human being could remain alive in the village, they still waited and hoped, but at last Yusula gave up the useless vigil. She was never there, he said, and now we must pursue the blacks and capture some of them, from whom we may learn the whereabouts of Lady Greystoke. It was daylight before they came upon a small band of stragglers who were in camp a few miles toward the west. These they quickly surrounded, winning their immediate surrender by promises of immunity in the event that they would answer truthfully the questions that Yusula should propound. "Where is Luvini?" demanded Yusula, who had learned the name of the leader of the West Coast boys from the Europeans the evening before. "We do not know. We have not seen him since we left the village," replied one of the blacks. "We were some of the slaves of the Arabs, and when we escaped the palisade last night we ran away from the others, for we thought that we should be safer alone than with Luvini, who is even crueler than the Arabs." "Did you see the white women that he brought to the camp last night?" demanded Yusula. "He brought but one white woman," replied the other. "What did he do with her? Where is she now?" asked Yusula. "I do not know. When he brought her, he bound her hand and foot and put her in the hut which he occupied near the village gate. We have not seen her since." Yusula turned and looked at his companions. A great fear was in his eyes, a fear that was reflected in the countenances of the others. "Come," he said, "we shall return to the village, and you will go with us," he added, addressing the West Coast blacks, "and if you have lied to us," he made a significant movement with his forefinger across his throat. "We have not lied to you," replied the others. Quickly they retraced their steps toward the ruins of the Arab village, nothing of which was left save a few piles of smoldering embers. "Where was the hut in which the white woman was confined?" demanded Yusula as they entered the smoking ruins. "Here," said one of the blacks, and walked quickly a few paces beyond what had been the village gateway. Suddenly he halted and pointed at something which lay upon the ground. "There," he said, "is the white woman you seek." Yusula and the others pressed forward. Rage and grief contended for mastery of them as they beheld, lying before them, the charred remnants of a human body. "It is," she said, Yusula, turning away to hide his grief, as the tears rolled down his ebon cheeks. The other Waziri were equally affected, for they all had loved the mate of the big Bwana. "Perhaps it is not," she suggested one of them, "perhaps it is another." "We can tell quickly," cried a third. "If her rings are among the ashes, it is indeed she," and he knelt and searched for the rings which Lady Greystoke habitually wore. Yusula shook his head despairingly. "It is she," he said. "There is the very stake to which she was fastened." He pointed to the blackened stub of a stake close beside the body. "And as for the rings, even if they are not there, it will mean nothing, for Luvini would have taken them away from her as soon as he captured her. There was time for everyone else to leave the village except she, who was bound and could not leave. No, it cannot be another." The Waziri scooped a shallow grave and reverently deposited the ashes there, marking the spot with a little cairn of stones. The golden lion with 2 mighty bounds was upon the high priest. Chapter 18. The Spoor of Revenge. As Tarzan of the Apes, adapting his speed to that of Jad Balja, made his comparatively slow way toward home, he reviewed with varying emotions the experiences of the past week. While he had been unsuccessful in raiding the treasure vaults of Opar, the sack of diamonds which he carried compensated several-fold for this miscarriage of his plans. His only concern now was for the safety of his Waziri and, perhaps, a troublesome desire to seek out the whites who had drugged him and mete out to them the punishment they deserved. In view, however, of his greater desire to return home, he decided to make no effort at apprehending them for the time being at least. Hunting together, feeding together, and sleeping together, the man and the great lion trod the savage jungle trails toward home. Yesterday they shared the meat of Bara, the deer. Today they feasted upon the carcass of Horta, the boar, and between them there was little chance that either would go hungry. They had come within a day's march of the bungalow when Tarzan discovered the spoor of a considerable body of warriors. As some men devour the latest stock market quotations as though their very existence depended upon an accurate knowledge of them, so Tarzan of the Apes devoured every scrap of information that the jungle held for him, for in truth, an accurate knowledge of all that this information could impart to him had been during his lifetime a sine qua non to his existence. So now he carefully examined the spoor that lay before him, several days old though it was, and partially obliterated by the passage of beasts since it had been made, but yet legible enough to the keen eyes and nostrils of the ape-man. His partial indifference suddenly gave way to keen interest, for among the footprints of the great warriors he saw now and again the smaller one of a white woman, a loved footprint that he knew as well as you know your mother's face. The Waziri returned and told her that I was missing, he soliloquized, and now she has set out with them to search for me. He turned to the lion. Well, Jad Balja, once again we turn away from home, but no, where she is home. The direction that the trail led rather mystified Tarzan of the Apes, as it was not along the direct route toward Opar, but in a rather more southerly direction. On the 6th day his keen ears caught the sound of approaching men, and presently there was wafted to his nostrils the spoor of blacks. Sending Jad Balja into a thicket to hide, Tarzan took to the trees and moved rapidly in the direction of the approaching Negroes. As the distance between them lessened, the scent became stronger, until even before he saw them, Tarzan knew that they were Waziri, but the one effluvium that would have filled his soul with happiness was lacking. It was a surprised Yusula who, at the head of the sad and dejected Waziri, came at the turning of the trail suddenly face to face with his master. Tarzan of the Apes, cried Yusula. Is it indeed you? It is none other, replied the ape-man, but where is Lady Greystoke? Ah, master, how can we tell you, cried Yusula. You do not mean, cried Tarzan. It cannot be. Nothing could happen to her while she was guarded by my Waziri. The warriors hung their heads in shame and sorrow. We offer our lives for her, said Yusula simply. He threw down his spear and shield and, stretching his arms wide apart, bared his great breast to Tarzan. Strike, Bwana, he said. The ape-man turned away with bowed head. Presently he looked at Yusula again. Tell me how it happened, he said, and forget your foolish speech as I have forgotten the suggestion which prompted it. Briefly Yusula narrated the events which had led up to the death of Jane, and when he was done Tarzan of the Apes spoke but 3 words, voicing a question which was typical of him. Where is Louvini, he asked. Ah, that we do not know, replied Yusula. But I shall know, said Tarzan of the Apes. Go upon your way, my children, back to your huts, and your women and your children, and when next you see Tarzan of the Apes you will know that Louvini is dead. They begged permission to accompany him, but he would not listen to them. You are needed at home at this time of year, he said. Already have you been gone too long from the herds and fields. Return then and carry word to Korak, but tell him that it is my wish that he too remains at home if I fail, then may he come and take up my unfinished work if he wishes to do so. As he ceased speaking he turned back in the direction from which he had come, and whistled once a single, low, long-drawn note, and a moment later Jad Balja, the golden lion, bounded into view along the jungle trail. The golden lion, cried Yusula. When he escaped from Kiwazi it was to search for his beloved Bwana. Tarzan nodded. He followed many marches to a strange country until he found me, he said, and then he bid the Waziri goodbye and bent his steps once more away from home in search of Louvini and revenge. John Peebles, wedged in the crotch of a large tree, greeted the coming dawn with weary eyes. Near him was Dick Throck, similarly braced in another crotch, while Krasky, more intelligent and therefore possessing more inventive genius, had rigged a small platform of branches across 2 parallel boughs, upon which he lay in comparative comfort. 10 feet above him Bloober swung, half exhausted and wholly terrified, to a smaller branch, supported in something that approximated safety by a fork of the branch to which he clung. God, groaned Peebles, I'll let the bloody lions ave me before I'll spend another such a night as this, and ere we are en that's that. And blime too, said Throck, I sleeps on the ground half to this, lions or no lions. If the combined intelligence of the 3 of you was equal to that of a walrus, remarked Krasky, we might have slept in comparative safety and comfort last night on the ground. Hey there, Bloober, Mr. Krasky is speaking to ye, called Peebles in fine sarcasm, accenting the Mr. Oi, oi. I don't care what nobody says, moaned Bloober. "He wants us to build a house for him every night," continued Peebles, "while he stands about and tells us bloomin' well how to do it, and being a fine gentleman, don't do no work." "Why should I do any work with my hands when you two big beasts haven't got anything else to work with?" asked Krasky. "You would all have starved by this time if I hadn't found food for you, and you'll be lion meat in the end, or die of exhaustion if you don't listen to me, not that it would be much loss." The others paid no attention to his last sally. As a matter of fact, they had all been quarreling so much for such a long time that they really paid little attention to one another. With the exception of Peebles and Throck, they all hated one another cordially and only clung together because they were afraid to separate. Slowly Peebles lowered his bulk to the ground. Throck followed him, and then came Krasky, and then finally Bloober, who stood for a moment in silence, looking down at his disreputable clothing. "Mein God," he exclaimed at last, "look at me. This suit, vote it cost me 20 guineas. Look at it. Ruined, ruined. It wouldn't bring 1 penny in the pound." "The hell with your clothes," exclaimed Krasky. "Here we are, lost, half-starved, constantly menaced by wild animals, and maybe, for all we know, by cannibals, with Flora missing in the jungle, and you can stand there and talk about your 20 guinea suit. You make me tired, Bloober. But come on, we might as well be moving." "Which way?" asked Throck. "Why, to the west, of course," replied Krasky. "The coast is there, and there is nothing else for us to do but try to reach it." "We can't reach it by going east," roared Peebles, "and here we are, and that's that." "Who said we could?" demanded Krasky. "Well, we was traveling east all day yesterday," said Peebles. "I knew all the time that there was something wrong, and I just got it figured out." Throck looked at his partner in stupid surprise. "What do you mean?" he growled. "What makes you think we was traveling east?" "It's easy enough," replied Peebles, "and I can prove it to you. Because this party here knows so much more than the rest of us. We've been traveling straight toward the interior ever since the niggers deserted us." He nodded toward the Russian, who stood with his hands on his hips, eyeing the other quizzically. "If you think I'm taking you in the wrong direction," Peebles said Krasky, "you just turn around and go the other way, but I'm going to keep on the way we've been going, which is the right way." "It ain't the right way," retorted Peebles, "and I'll show ya." "Listen here. When you travel west, the sun is at your left side, isn't it? That is all during the middle of the day. Well, ever since we've been traveling without the niggers, the sun has been on our right. I thought all the time there was something wrong, but I could never figure it out until just now. It's plain as the face on your nose. We've been traveling due east right along." "Blime," cried Throck, "that we have due east, and this blighter thinks as how he knows it all." "Oi," groaned Bloober, "und we got to walk it all back again yet, once more." Krasky laughed and turned away to resume the march in the direction he had chosen. "You fellows go on your own way if you want to," he said, "and while you're traveling, just ponder the fact that you're south of the equator and that therefore the sun is always in the north, which, however, doesn't change its old-fashioned habit of setting in the west." Bloober was the first to grasp the truth of Krasky's statement. "Come on, boys," he said. "Karl V.S. right," and he turned and followed the Russian. Peebles stood scratching his head, entirely baffled by the puzzling problem, which Throck also was pondering deeply. Presently the latter turned after Bloober and Krasky. "Come on, John," he said to Peebles. "I don't understand it, but I guess they're right. They are heading right toward where the sun set last night, and that sure must be west." His theory tottering, Peebles followed Throck, though he remained unconvinced. The 4 men, hungry and footsore, had dragged their weary way along the jungle trail toward the west for several hours in vain search for game. Unschooled in jungle craft, they blundered on. There might have been on every hand fierce carnivore or savage warriors, but so dull are the perceptive faculties of civilized man, the most blatant foe might have stalked them unperceived. And so it was that shortly after noon, as they were crossing a small clearing, the zip of an arrow that barely missed Bloober's head brought them to a sudden terrified halt. With a shrill scream of terror, the Jew crumpled to the ground. Krasky threw his rifle to his shoulder and fired. "There," he cried, "behind those bushes," and then another arrow from another direction pierced his forearm. Peebles and Throck, beefy and cumbersome, got into action with less celerity than the Russian, but like him, they showed no indication of fear. "Down," cried Krasky, suiting the action to the word. "Lie down and let them have it." Scarcely had the 3 men dropped among the long grass when a score of pygmy hunters came into the open, and a volley of arrows whizzed above the prone men, while from a nearby tree 2 steel-grey eyes looked down upon the ambush. Bloober lay upon his belly with his face buried in his arms, his useless rifle lying at his side, but Krasky, Peebles, and Throck, fighting for their lives, pumped lead into the band of yelling pygmies. Krasky and Peebles each dropped a native with his rifle, and then the foe withdrew into the concealing safety of the surrounding jungle. For a moment there was a cessation of hostilities. Utter silence reigned, and then a voice broke the quiet from the verdure of a nearby forest giant. "Do not fire until I tell you to," it said in English, "and I will save you." Bloober raised his head. Come Kuvik, he cried, "We will not shoot. Save me, save me, save me, and I give you £5. From the tree from which the voice had issued there came a single, low, long-drawn, whistled note, and then silence for a time. The pygmies, momentarily surprised by the mysterious voice emanating from the foliage of a tree, ceased their activities, but presently, hearing nothing to arouse their fear, they emerged from the cover of the bushes and launched another volley of arrows toward the 4 men lying among the grasses in the clearing. Simultaneously, the figure of a giant white leaped from the lower branches of a patriarch of the jungle as a great black-maned lion sprang from the thicket below. "Oi!" shrieked Bloober and again buried his face in his arms. For an instant, the pygmies stood terrified, and then their leader cried, "It is Tarzan," and turned and fled into the jungle. "Yes, it is Tarzan, Tarzan of the apes," cried Lord Greystoke. "It is Tarzan and the golden lion," but he spoke in the dialect of the pygmies, and the whites understood no word of what he said. Then he turned to them. "The Gomangani have gone," he said. "Get up." The 4 men crawled to their feet. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" demanded Tarzan of the apes. "But I do not need to ask who you are. You are the men who drugged me and left me helpless in your camp, a prey to the first passing lion or savage native." Bloober stumbled forward, rubbing his palms together and cringing and smiling. Oi, Mr. Tarzan, we did not know you. Never would we did what we done, had we known it was Tarzan of the apes. Save me, £10 to £20 anything. Name your own price. Save me and it is yours." Tarzan ignored the Jew and turned toward the others. "I am looking for one of your men," he said, "a black named Levini. He killed my wife. Where is he?" "We know nothing of that," said Krasky. "Levini betrayed us and deserted us. Your wife and another white woman were in our camp at the time. None of us knows what became of them. They were behind us when we took our post to defend the camp from our men and the slaves of the Arabs. Your Waziri were there. After the enemy had withdrawn, we found that the 2 women had disappeared. We do not know what became of them. We are looking for them now." "My Waziri told me as much," said Tarzan, "but have you seen aught of Levini since?" "No, we have not," replied Krasky. "What are you doing here?" demanded Tarzan. "We came with Mr. Bloober on a scientific expedition," replied the Russian. "We have had a great deal of trouble. Our head men, Askari and porters, have mutinied and deserted. We are absolutely alone and helpless." Oi, cried Bloober. Save us, but keep that lion away. He makes me nervous." "He will not hurt you unless I tell him to," said Tarzan. "Then please don't tell him to," cried Bloober. "Where do you want to go?" asked Tarzan. "We are trying to get back to the coast," replied Krasky, "and from there to London." "Come with me," said Tarzan. "Possibly I can help you. You do not deserve it, but I cannot see white men perish here in the jungle." They followed him toward the west, and that night they made camp beside a small jungle stream. It was difficult for the 4 Londoners to accustom themselves to the presence of the great lion, and Bloober was in a state of palpable terror. As they squatted around the fire after the evening meal which Tarzan had provided, Krasky suggested that they set to and build some sort of a shelter against the wild beasts. "It will not be necessary," said Tarzan. "Jad Balja will guard you. He will sleep here beside Tarzan of the apes, and what one of us does not hear the other will." Bloober sighed. "Mein Gott," he cried, "I should give £10 for one night's sleep." "You may have it tonight for less than that," replied Tarzan, "for nothing shall befall you while Jad Balja and I are here." "Vel, den I think I say good night," said the Jew, and moving a few paces away from the fire he curled up and was soon asleep. Throck and Peebles followed suit, and shortly after Krasky too. As the Russian lay half-dozing, his eyes partially open, he saw the ape-man rise from the squatting position he had maintained before the fire and turn toward a nearby tree. As he did so, something fell from beneath his loincloth, a little sack, made of hides, a little sack, bulging with its contents. Krusky, thoroughly awakened now, watched it as the ape-man moved off a short distance, accompanied by Jad Balja, and lay down to sleep. The great lion curled beside the prostrate man, and presently the Russian was assured that both slept. Immediately he commenced crawling stealthily and slowly toward the little package lying beside the fire. With each forward move that he made, he paused and looked at the recumbent figures of the two ferocious beasts before him, but both slept on peacefully. At last the Russian could reach out and grasp the sack, and drawing it toward him, he stuffed it quickly inside his shirt. Then he turned and crawled slowly and carefully back to his place beyond the fire. There, lying with his head upon one arm as though in profound slumber, he felt carefully of the sack with the fingers of his left hand. "They feel like pebbles," he muttered to himself, "and doubtless that is what they are, for the barbaric ornamentation of this savage barbarian who is a peer of England. It does not seem possible that this wild beast has sat in the House of Lords." Noiselessly Krusky undid the knot which held the mouth of the sack closed, and a moment later he let a portion of the contents trickle forth into his open palm. "My God," he cried, "diamonds." Greedily he poured them all out and gloated over them, great scintillating stones of the first water, 5 pounds of pure, white diamonds, representing so fabulous a fortune that the very contemplation of it staggered the Russian. "My God," he repeated, "the wealth of Croesus in my own hand." Quickly he gathered up the stones and replaced them in the sack, always with one eye upon Tarzan and Jad Balja, but neither stirred, and presently he had returned them all to the pouch and slipped the package inside his shirt. "Tomorrow," he muttered, "tomorrow, would to God that I had the nerve to attempt it tonight." In the middle of the following morning, Tarzan, with the 4 Londoners, approached a good-sized, stockaded village, containing many huts. He was received not only graciously, but with the deference due an emperor. The whites were awed by the attitude of the black chief and his warriors as Tarzan was conducted into their presence. After the usual ceremony had been gone through, Tarzan turned and waved his hand toward the 4 Europeans. "These are my friends," he said to the black chief, "and they wish to reach the coast in safety. Send with them, then, sufficient warriors to feed and guard them during the journey. It is I, Tarzan of the Apes, who requests this favor." "Tarzan of the Apes, the great chief, lord of the jungle, has but to command," replied the black. "Good," exclaimed Tarzan, "feed them well and treat them well. I have other business to attend to and may not remain." "Their bellies shall be filled, and they shall reach the coast unscathed," replied the chief. Without a word of farewell, without even a sign that he realized their existence, Tarzan of the Apes passed from the sight of the 4 Europeans, while at his heels paced Jad Balja, the golden lion. Hunting together, the man and the great lion trod the paths toward home. Chapter 19. A barbed shaft kills. Krusky spent a sleepless night. He could not help but realize that sooner or later Tarzan would discover the loss of his pouch of diamonds, and that he would return and demand an accounting of the 4 Londoners he had befriended. And so it was that, as the first streak of dawn lighted the eastern horizon, the Russian arose from his pallet of dried grasses within the hut that had been assigned him in Bloober by the chief, and crept stealthily out into the village street. "God," he muttered to himself, "there is only one chance in 1,000 that I can reach the coast alone, but this—" and he pressed his hand over the bag of diamonds that lay within his shirt. "But this is worth every effort, even to the sacrifice of life, the fortune of 1,000 kings. My God, what could I not do with it in London and Paris and New York?" Stealthily he slunk from the village, and presently the verdure of the jungle beyond closed about Karl Krusky the Russian, as he disappeared forever from the lives of his companions. Bloober was the first to discover the absence of Krusky, for although there was no love between the two, they had been thrown together, owing to the friendship of Peebles and Throck. "Have you seen Karl this morning?" he asked Peebles as the 3 men gathered around the pot containing the unsavory stew that had been brought to them for their breakfast. "No," said Peebles, "he must be asleep yet." "He is not in the hut," replied Bloober. "He vas not der when I woke up." "He can take care of himself," growled Throck, resuming his breakfast. "You'll likely find him with some of the ladies," and he grinned in appreciation of his little joke on Krusky's well-known weakness. They had finished their breakfast and were attempting to communicate with some of the warriors in an effort to learn when the chief proposed that they should set forth for the coast, and still Krusky had not made an appearance. By this time Blueber was considerably concerned not at all for Kraski's safety but for his own, since if something could happen to Kraski in this friendly village in the still watches of the night, a similar fate might overtake him. And when he made this suggestion to the others, it gave them food for thought too, so that there were 3 rather apprehensive men who sought an audience with the chief. By means of signs and pidgin English and distorted native dialect, a word or two of which each of the 3 understood, they managed to convey to the chief the information that Kraski had disappeared, and that they wanted to know what had become of him. The chief was, of course, as much puzzled as they, and immediately instituted a thorough search of the village, with the result that it was soon found that Kraski was not within the palisade, and shortly afterward footprints were discovered leading through the village gateway into the jungle. "Mein Gott," exclaimed Blueber, "he went out there, and he went alone in the middle of the night. He must have been crazy." "Gord," cried Throck, "what did he want to do that for?" "You ain't missed nothing. Have you asked Peebles of the other 2? He might have stolen something." Oi, what have we got to steal?" cried Blueber. "Our guns, our ammunition, they are here beside us. He did not take them. Beside those we have nothing of value except my 20 guinea suit." "But what did he do it for?" demanded Peebles. "He must have been walking in his bloomin' sleep," said Throck. And that was as near to an explanation of Kraski's mysterious disappearance as the 3 could reach. An hour later they set out toward the coast under the protection of a company of the chief's warriors. Kraski, his rifle slung over his shoulder, moved doggedly along the jungle trail, a heavy automatic pistol grasped in his right hand. His ears were constantly strained for the first intimation of pursuit as well as for whatever other dangers might lurk before or upon either side. Alone in the mysterious jungle he was experiencing a nightmare of terror, and with each mile that he traveled the value of the diamonds became less and less by comparison with the frightful ordeal that he realized he must pass through before he could hope to reach the coast. Once Hista, the snake, swinging from a low-hung branch across the trail, barred his way, and the man dared not fire at him for fear of attracting the attention of possible pursuers to his position. He was forced, therefore, to make a detour through the tangled mass of underbrush which grew closely upon either side of the narrow trail. When he reached it again, beyond the snake, his clothing was more torn and tattered than before, and his flesh was scratched and cut and bleeding from the innumerable thorns past which he had been compelled to force his way. He was soaked with perspiration and panting from exhaustion, and his clothing was filled with ants whose vicious attacks upon his flesh rendered him half mad with pain. Once again in the clear, he tore his clothing from him and sought frantically to rid himself of the torturing pests. So thick were the myriad ants upon his clothing that he dared not attempt to reclaim it. Only the sack of diamonds, his ammunition, and his weapons did he snatch from the ravening horde whose numbers were rapidly increasing, apparently by millions, as they sought to again lay hold upon him and devour him. Shaking the bulk of the ants from the articles he had retrieved, Kraski dashed madly along the trail as naked as the day he was born, and when, a half-hour later, stumbling and at last falling exhausted, he lay panting upon the damp jungle earth, he realized the utter futility of his mad attempt to reach the coast alone, even more fully than he ever could have under any other circumstances, since there is nothing that so paralyzes the courage and self-confidence of a civilized man as to be deprived of his clothing. However scant the protection that might have been afforded by the torn and tattered garments he had discarded, he could not have felt more helpless had he lost his weapons and ammunition instead, for to such an extent are we the creatures of habit and environment. It was therefore a terrified Kraski, already foredoomed to failure, who crawled fearfully along the jungle trail. That night, hungry and cold, he slept in the crotch of a great tree, while the hunting carnivore roared and coughed and growled through the blackness of the jungle about him. Shivering with terror, he started momentarily to fearful wakefulness, and when from exhaustion he would doze again, it was not to rest but to dream of horrors that a sudden roar would merge into reality. Thus the long hours of a frightful night dragged out their tedious length, until it seemed that dawn would never come. But come it did, and once again he took up his stumbling way toward the west. Reduced by fear and fatigue and pain to a state bordering upon half-consciousness, he blundered on, with each passing hour becoming perceptibly weaker, for he had been without food or water since he had deserted his companions more than 30 hours before. Noon was approaching. Kraski was moving but slowly now with frequent rests, and it was during one of these that there came to his numbed sensibilities an insistent suggestion of the voices of human beings not far distant. Quickly he shook himself and attempted to concentrate his waning faculties. He listened intently, and presently with a renewal of strength he arose to his feet. There was no doubt about it, he heard voices but a short distance away, and they sounded not like the tones of natives, but rather those of Europeans. Yet he was still careful, and so he crawled cautiously forward, until at a turning of the trail he saw before him a clearing dotted with trees which bordered the banks of a muddy stream. Near the edge of the river was a small hut thatched with grasses and surrounded by a rude palisade and further protected by an outer boma of thorn bushes. It was from the direction of the hut that the voices were coming, and now he clearly discerned a woman's voice raised in protest and in anger, and replying to it the deep voice of a man. Slowly the eyes of Karl Kraski went wide in incredulity, not unmixed with terror, for the tones of the voice of the man he heard were the tones of the dead Esteban Miranda, and the voice of the woman was that of the missing Flora Hawks, whom he had long since given up as dead also. But Karl Kraski was no great believer in the supernatural. Disembodied spirits need no huts or palisades or bomas of thorns. The owners of those voices were as live as material as he. He started forward toward the hut, his hatred of Esteban and his jealousy almost forgotten in the relief he felt in the realization that he was to again have the companionship of creatures of his own kind. He had moved, however, but a few steps from the edge of the jungle when the woman's voice came again to his ear, and with it the sudden realization of his nakedness. He paused in thought, looking about him, and presently he was busily engaged gathering the long, broad-leaved jungle grasses, from which he fabricated a rude but serviceable skirt, which he fastened about his waist with a twisted rope of the same material. Then, with a feeling of renewed confidence, he moved forward toward the hut, fearing that they might not recognize him at first, and taking him for an enemy, attack him Kraski before he reached the entrance to the palisade, called Esteban by name. Immediately the Spaniard came from the hut, followed by the girl. Had Kraski not heard his voice and recognized him by it, he would have thought him Tarzan of the apes, so close was the remarkable resemblance. For a moment the two stood looking at the strange apparition before them. "Don't you know me?" asked Kraski. "I am Karl Kraski. You know me, Flora?" "Karl," exclaimed the girl, and started to leap forward, but Esteban grasped her by the wrist and held her back. "What are you doing here?" Kraski asked the Spaniard in a surly tone. "I am trying to make my way to the coast," replied the Russian. "I am nearly dead from starvation and exposure." "The way to the coast is there," said the Spaniard, and pointed down the trail toward the west. "Keep moving, Kraski, it is not healthy for you here." "You mean to say that you will send me on without food or water?" demanded the Russian. "There is water," said Esteban, pointing at the river, "and the jungle is full of food for one with sufficient courage and intelligence to gather it." "You cannot send him away," cried the girl. "I did not think it possible that even you could be so cruel." And then, turning to the Russian, "Oh, Karl," she cried, "do not go. Save me from this beast." "Then stand aside," cried Kraski, and as the girl wrenched herself free from the grasp of Miranda, the Russian leveled his automatic and fired point blank at the Spaniard. The bullet missed its target, the empty shell jammed in the breech, and as Kraski pulled the trigger again with no result, he glanced at his weapon and, discovering its uselessness, hurled it from him with an oath. As he strove frantically to bring his rifle into action, Esteban threw back his spear hand with the short, heavy spear that he had learned by now so well to use, and before the other could press the trigger of his rifle, the barbed shaft tore through his chest and heart. Without a sound, Karl Kraski sank dead at the foot of his enemy and his rival, while the woman both had loved, each in his own selfish or brutal way, sank sobbing to the ground in the last and deepest depths of despair. Seeing that the other was dead, Esteban stepped forward and wrenched his spear from Kraski's body, and also relieved his dead enemy of his ammunition and weapons. As he did so, his eyes fell upon a little bag made of skins which Kraski had fastened to his waist by the grass rope he had recently fashioned to uphold his primitive skirt. The Spaniard felt of the bag and tried to figure out the nature of its contents, coming to the conclusion that it was ammunition, but he did not examine it closely until he had carried the dead man's weapons into his hut, where he had also taken the girl, who crouched in a corner, sobbing. Poor Karl, she moaned, and then to the man facing her, "You beast." "Yes," he cried with a laugh, "I am a beast. I am Tarzan of the apes, and that dirty Russian dared to call me Esteban. I am Tarzan, I am Tarzan. I am Tarzan of the apes," he repeated in a loud scream. "Who dares call me otherwise dies. I will show them, I will show them, I will show them," he mumbled. The girl looked at him with wide and flaming eyes and shuddered. "Mad," she muttered. Mad. My God, alone in the jungle with a maniac, and in truth, in one respect was Esteban Miranda mad with the madness of the artist who lives the part he plays. And for so long now had Esteban Miranda played the part, and so really proficient had he become in his interpretation of the noble character, that he believed himself Tarzan, and in outward appearance he might have deceived the ape-man's best friend. But within that godlike form was the heart of a cur and the soul of a craven. He would have stolen Tarzan's mate, muttered Esteban. Tarzan, lord of the jungle. Did you see how I slew him? With a single shaft you could love a weakling, could you, when you could have the love of the great Tarzan? I loathe you, said the girl. You are indeed a beast. You are lower than the beasts. You are mine, though, said the Spaniard, and you shall never be another's. First I would kill you, but let us see what the Russian had in his little bag of hides. It feels like ammunition enough to kill a regiment. And he untied the thongs that held the mouth of the bag closed and let some of the contents spill out upon the floor of the hut. As the sparkling stones rolled scintillant before their astonished eyes, the girl gasped in incredulity. Holy Mary, exclaimed the Spaniard, they are diamonds. Hundreds of them, murmured the girl. Where could he have gotten them? I do not know, and I do not care, said Esteban. They are mine, they are all mine. I am rich, Flora, I am rich, and if you are a good girl, you shall share my wealth with me. Flora Hawkes's eyes narrowed. Awakened within her breast was the always present greed that dominated her being, and beside it, and equally as powerful now to dominate her, her hatred for the Spaniard. Could he have known it, possession of those gleaming baubles had crystallized at last in the mind of the woman a determination she had long fostered to slay the Spaniard while he slept. Heretofore she had been afraid of being left alone in the jungle, but now the desire to possess this great wealth overcame her terror. Tarzan, ranging the jungle, picked up the trail of the various bands of West Coast boys and the fleeing slaves of the dead Arabs, and overhauling each in turn he prosecuted his search for Louvini, awing the blacks into truthfulness and leaving them in a state of terror when he departed. Each and every one they told him the same story. There was none who had seen Louvini since the night of the battle and the fire, and each was positive that he must have escaped with some other band. So thoroughly occupied had the ape-man's mind been during the past few days with his sorrow and his search that lesser considerations had gone neglected, with the result that he had not noted that the bag containing the diamonds was missing. In fact, he had practically forgotten the diamonds when, by the merest vagary of chance, his mind happened to revert to them, and then it was that he suddenly realized that they were missing, but when he had lost them, or the circumstances surrounding the loss, he could not recall. Those rascally Europeans, he muttered to Jad Baljah, they must have taken them, and suddenly with the thought the scarlet scar flamed brilliantly upon his forehead, as just anger welled within him against the perfidy and ingratitude of the men he had succored. Come, he said to Jad Baljah, as we search for Louvini, we shall search for these others also. And so it was that Peebles and Throck and Bloober had travelled but a short distance toward the coast when, during a noonday halt, they were surprised to see the figure of the ape-man moving majestically toward them while, at his side, paced the great, black-maned lion. Tarzan made no acknowledgement of their exuberant greeting, but came forward in silence to stand at last with folded arms before them. There was a grim, accusing expression upon his countenance that brought the chill of fear to Bloober's cowardly heart and blanched the faces of the two hardened English pugs. What is it, they chorused? What is wrong? What has happened? I have come for the bag of stones you took from me, said Tarzan simply. Each of the three eyed his companion suspiciously. I do not understand what you mean, Mr. Tarzan, purred Bloober, rubbing his palms together. I am sure there is some mistake, unless he cast a furtive and suspicious glance in the direction of Peebles and Throck. I don't know nothing about no bag of stones, said Peebles, but I will say as how you can't trust no Jew. I don't trust any of you, said Tarzan. I will give you 5 seconds to hand over the bag of stones, and if you don't produce it in that time I shall have you thoroughly searched. Sure, cried Bloober, search me by all means. Vy, Mr. Tarzan, I wouldn't take nothing from you for nothing. There's something wrong here, growled Throck. I ain't got nothing of yours, and I'm sure these two haven't neither. Where is the other? Asked Tarzan. Okraski? He disappeared the same night you brought us to that village. We hain't seen him since. That's it. I got it now. We wondered why he left. And now I see it as plain as the face on me nose. It was him that stole that bag of stones. That's what he'd done. We've been trying to figure out ever since he left what he stole, and now I see it plain enough. Sure, exclaimed Peebles. That's it. And ere we are, and that's that. V might have noted, agreed Bloober. But nevertheless I'm going to have you all searched, said Tarzan, and when the headman came and Tarzan had explained what he desired, the three whites were quickly stripped and searched. Even their few belongings were thoroughly gone through, but no bag of stones was revealed. Without a word, Tarzan turned back toward the jungle, and in another moment the blacks and the three Europeans saw the leafy sea of foliage swallow the ape-man and the golden lion. "Gord help Krasky," exclaimed Peebles. "What do ye suppose he wants with a bag o' stones?" inquired Throck. "He must be a bit balmy, I'll say." "Balmy nudding," exclaimed Bloober. "There is but one kind of stones in Africa what Krasky would steal and run off into their jungle alone, and might be diamonds." Peebles and Throck opened their eyes in surprise. "The damned Russian," exclaimed the former. "He double-crossed us, that's what he did." "He likely has not saved our lives," said Throck. "If this ape feller had found Krasky and the diamonds with us, we'd have all suffered alike. You couldn't have made him believe we didn't have a hand in it. And Krasky wouldn't have done nothing to help us out." "I hopes he catches the beggar," exclaimed Peebles fervently. They were startled into silence a moment later by the sight of Tarzan returning to the camp, but he paid no attention to the whites, going instead directly to the headman, with whom he conferred for several minutes. Then, once more, he turned and left. Acting on information gained from the headman, Tarzan struck off through the jungle in the general direction of the village where he had left the four whites in charge of the chief, and from which Krasky had later escaped alone. He moved rapidly, leaving Jad Balya to follow behind, covering the distance to the village in a comparatively short time, since he moved almost in an airline through the trees, where there was no matted undergrowth to impede his progress. Outside the village gate he took up Krasky's spoor, now almost obliterated it is true, but still legible to the keen perceptive faculties of the ape-man. This he followed swiftly, since Krasky had clung tenaciously to the open trail that wound in a general westward direction. The sun had dropped almost to the western treetops when Tarzan came suddenly upon a clearing beside a sluggish stream, near the banks of which stood a small, rude hut, surrounded by a palisade and a thorn boma. The ape-man paused and listened, sniffing the air with his sensitive nostrils, and then on noiseless feet he crossed the clearing toward the hut. In the grass outside the palisade lay the dead body of a white man, and a single glance told the ape-man that it was the fugitive whom he sought. Instantly he realized the futility of searching the corpse for the bag of diamonds, since it was a foregone conclusion that they were now in the possession of whoever had slain the Russian. A perfunctory examination revealed the fact that he was right in so far as the absence of the diamonds was concerned. Both inside the hut and outside the palisade were indications of the recent presence of a man and woman, the spoor of the former tallying with that of the creature who had killed Gobu, the great ape, and hunted Bara, the deer, upon the preserves of the ape-man. But the woman, who was she? It was evident that she had been walking upon sore, tired feet, and that in lieu of shoes she wore bandages of cloth. Tarzan followed the spoor of the man and the woman where it led from the hut into the jungle. As it progressed, it became apparent that the woman had been lagging behind, and that she had commenced to limp more and more painfully. Her progress was very slow, and Tarzan could see that the man had not waited for her, but that he had been, in some places, a considerable distance ahead of her. And so it was that Esteban had forged far ahead of Flora Hawkes, whose bruised and bleeding feet would scarce support her. "Wait for me, Esteban," she had pleaded. "Do not desert me. Do not leave me alone here in this terrible jungle." "Then keep up with me," growled the Spaniard. "Do you think that, with this fortune in my possession, I am going to wait here forever in the middle of the jungle for someone to come and take it away from me? No, I am going on to the coast as fast as I can. If you can keep up, well and good. If you cannot, that is your own lookout. But you could not desert me. Even you, Esteban, could not be such a beast after all that you have forced me to do for you." The Spaniard laughed. "You are nothing more to me," he said, "than an old glove. With this," and he held the sack of diamonds before him, "I can purchase the finest gloves in the capitals of the world, new gloves," and he laughed grimly at his little joke. "Esteban, Esteban," she cried, "come back, come back. I can go no farther. Do not leave me. Please come back and save me." But he only laughed at her, and as a turn of the trail shut him from her sight, she sank helpless and exhausted to the ground, Chapter 20. The Dead Return. That night, Esteban made his lonely camp beside a jungle trail that wound through the dry wash of an old riverbed, along which a tiny rivulet still trickled, affording the Spaniard the water which he craved. The obsession which possessed him that he was in truth Tarzan of the apes imparted to him a false courage, so that he could camp alone upon the ground without recourse to artificial protection of any kind. And fortune had favored him in this respect, in that it had sent no prowling beasts of prey to find him upon those occasions that he had dared too much. During the period that Flora Hawkes had been with him, he had built shelters for her, but now that he had deserted her and was again alone, he could not, in the role that he had assumed, consider so effeminate an act as the building of even a thorn boma for protection during the darkness of the night. He did, however, build a fire, for he had made a kill and had not yet reached a point of primitive savagery which permitted him even to imagine that he enjoyed raw meat. Having devoured what meat he wanted and filled himself at the little rivulet, Esteban came back and squatted before his fire, where he drew the pouch of diamonds from his loincloth, and opening it, spilled a handful of the precious gems into his palm. The flickering firelight playing upon them sent scintillant gleams shooting into the dark of the surrounding jungle night, as the Spaniard let a tiny stream of the sparkling stones trickle from one hand to the other, and in the pretty play of light the Spaniard saw visions of the future power. Luxury, beautiful women, all that great wealth might purchase for a man. With half-closed eyes he dreamed of the ideal that he should search the world over to obtain the dream woman for whom he had always searched, the dream woman he had never found, the fit companion for such as Esteban Miranda imagined himself to be. Presently, through the dark lashes that veiled his narrowed lids, the Spaniard seemed to see before him in the flickering light of his campfire a vague materialization of the figure of his dream, a woman's figure, clothed in flowing diaphanous white, which appeared to hover just above him at the outer rim of his firelight at the summit of the ancient river bank. It was strange how the vision persisted. Esteban closed his eyes tightly and then opened them ever so little, and there, as it had been before he closed them, the vision remained, and then he opened his eyes wide, and still the figure of the woman in white floated above him. Esteban Miranda went suddenly pale. "Mother of God," he cried, "it is Flora. She is dead and has come back to haunt me." With staring eyes he slowly rose to his feet to confront the apparition, when in soft and gentle tones it spoke. "Heart of my heart," it cried, "it is really you." Instantly Esteban realized that this was no disembodied spirit, nor was it Flora, but who was it? Who was this vision of beauty, alone in the savage African wilderness? Very slowly now it was descending the embankment and coming toward him. Esteban returned the diamonds to the pouch and replaced it inside his loincloth. With outstretched arms the girl came toward him. "My love, my love, my love," she cried, "do not tell me that you do not know me." She was close enough now for the Spaniard to see her rapidly rising and falling breasts and her lips trembling with love and passion. A sudden wave of hot desire swept over him, so with outstretched arms he sprang forward to meet her and crush her to his breast. Tarzan, following the spoor of the man and the woman, moved in a leisurely manner along the jungle trail, for he realized that no haste was essential to overtake these two. Nor was he at all surprised when he came suddenly upon the huddled figure of a woman, lying in the center of the pathway. He knelt beside her and laid a hand upon her shoulder, eliciting a startled scream. "God," she cried, "this is the end." "You are in no danger," said the ape-man. "I will not harm you." She turned her eyes and looked up at him. At first she thought he was Esteban. "You have come back to save me, Esteban?" she asked. "Esteban," he exclaimed. "I am not Esteban. That is not my name." And then she recognized him. "Lord Greystoke," she cried. "It is really you." "Yes," he said, "and who are you?" "I am Flora Hawkes. I was Lady Greystoke's maid." "I remember you," he said. "What are you doing here?" "I am afraid to tell you," she said. "I am afraid of your anger." "Tell me," he commanded. "You should know, Flora, that I do not harm women." "We came to get gold from the vaults of Opar," she said, "but that you know." "I know nothing of it," he replied. "Do you mean that you were with those Europeans who drugged me and left me in their camp?" "Yes," she said, "we got the gold, but you came with your waziri and took it from us." "I came with no waziri and took nothing from you," said Tarzan. "I do not understand you." She raised her eyebrows in surprise, for she knew that Tarzan of the Apes did not lie. "We became separated," she said, "after our men turned against us. Esteban stole me from the others, and then after a while Krasky found us. He was the Russian. He came with a bag full of diamonds, and then Esteban killed him and took the diamonds." It was now Tarzan's turn to experience surprise. "And Esteban is the man who is with you?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "but he has deserted me. I could not walk farther on my sore feet. He has gone and left me here to die, and he has taken the diamonds with him." "We shall find him," said the ape-man. "Come." "But I cannot walk," said the girl. "That is a small matter," he said, and stooping lifted her to his shoulder. Easily the ape-man bore the exhausted girl along the trail. "It is not far to water," he said, "and water is what you need. It will help to revive you and give you strength. And perhaps I shall be able to find food for you soon." "Why are you so good to me?" asked the girl. "You are a woman. I could not leave you alone in the jungle to die, no matter what you may have done," replied the ape-man, and Flora Hawks could only sob a broken plea for forgiveness for the wrong she had done him. It grew quite dark, but still they moved along the silent trail, until presently Tarzan caught in the distance the reflection of firelight. "I think we shall soon find your friend," he whispered. "Make no noise." A moment later his keen ears caught the sound of voices. He halted and lowered the girl to her feet. "If you cannot follow," he said, "wait here. I do not wish him to escape. I will return for you. If you can follow on slowly, do so." And then he left her and made his way cautiously forward toward the light and the voices. He heard Flora Hawks moving directly behind him. It was evident that she could not bear the thought of being left alone again in the dark jungle. Almost simultaneously Tarzan heard a low whine a few paces to his right. "Jadbal Ya," he whispered in a low voice, "heel," and the great black-maned lion crept close to him, and Flora Hawks, stifling a scream, rushed to his side and grasped his arms. "Silence," he whispered, "Jadbal Ya will not harm you." An instant later the three came to the edge of the ancient river bank, and through the tall grasses growing there looked down upon the little camp beneath. Tarzan, to his consternation, saw a counterpart of himself standing before a little fire, while slowly approaching the man, with outstretched arms, was a woman, draped in flowing white. He heard her words, soft words of love and endearment, and at the sound of the voice and the scent spoor that a vagrant wind carried suddenly to his nostrils, a strange complex of emotion overwhelmed him: happiness, despair, rage, love, and hate. He saw the man at the fire step forward with open arms to take the woman to his breast, and then Tarzan separated the grasses and stepped to the very edge of the embankment, his voice shattering the jungle with a single word. "Jane," he cried, and instantly the man and woman turned and looked up at him, where his figure was dimly revealed in the light of the campfire. At sight of him the man wheeled and raced for the jungle on the opposite side of the river, and then Tarzan leaped to the bottom of the wash below and ran toward the woman. "Jane," he cried, "it is you. It is you." The woman showed her bewilderment. She looked first at the retreating figure of the man she had been about to embrace, and then turned her eyes toward Tarzan. She drew her fingers across her brow and looked back toward Esteban, but Esteban was no longer in sight. Then she took a faltering step toward the ape-man. "My God," she cried, "what does it mean? Who are you? And if you are Tarzan, who was he?" "I am Tarzan," Jane said, the ape-man. She looked back and saw Flora Hawks approaching. "Yes," she said, "you are Tarzan. I saw you when you ran off into the jungle with Flora Hawks. I cannot understand, John. I could not believe that you, even had you suffered an accident to your head, could have done such a thing." "I run off into the jungle with Flora Hawks?" he asked, in unfeigned surprise. "I saw you," said Jane. The ape-man turned toward Flora. "I do not understand it," he said. "It was Esteban who ran off into the jungle with me," Lady Greystoke said the girl. "It was Esteban who was about to deceive you again. This is indeed Lord Greystoke. The other was an impostor who only just deserted me and left me to die in the jungle. Had not Lord Greystoke come when he did, I should be dead by now." Lady Greystoke took a faltering step toward her husband. "Ah, John," she said, "I knew it could not have been you. My heart told me, but my eyes deceived me. Quick," she cried, "that impostor must be captured. Hurry, John, before he escapes." "Let him go," said the ape-man. "As much as I want him, as much as I want that which he has stolen from me, I will not leave you alone again in the jungle, Jane, even to catch him." "But Jad Baljah," she cried. "What of him?" "Ah," cried the ape-man, "I had forgotten," and turning to the lion he pointed toward the direction that the Spaniard had escaped. "Fetch him, Jad Baljah," he cried, and with a bound the tawny beast was off upon the spoor of his quarry. "He will kill him?" asked Flora Hawkes, shuddering, and yet at heart she was glad of the just fate that was overtaking the Spaniard. "No, he will not kill him," said Tarzan of the Apes. "He may maul him a bit, but he will bring him back alive if it is possible." And then, as though the fate of the fugitive was already forgotten, he turned toward his mate. "Jane," he said, "Yusla told me that you were dead. He said that they found your burned body in the Arab village and that they buried it there. How is it, then, that you are here alive and unharmed? I have been searching the jungles for Louvini to avenge your death. Perhaps it is well that I did not find him." "You would never have found him," replied Jane Clayton, "but I cannot understand why Yusla should have told you that he had found my body and buried it." "Some prisoners that he took," replied Tarzan, "told him that Louvini had taken you bound hand and foot into one of the Arab huts near the village gateway, and that there he had further secured you to a stake driven into the floor of the hut. After the village had been destroyed by fire, Yusla and the other Waziri returned to search for you with some of the prisoners they had taken, who pointed out the location of the hut, where the charred remains of a human body were found beside a burned stake to which it had apparently been tied." "Ah," exclaimed the girl, "I see. Louvini did bind me hand and foot and tie me to the stake, but later he came back into the hut and removed the bonds. He attempted to attack me. How long we fought I do not know, but so engrossed were we in our struggle that neither one of us was aware of the burning of the village about us. As I persistently fought him off, I caught a glimpse of a knife in his belt, and then I let him seize me, and as his arms encircled me I grasped the knife and, drawing it from its sheath, plunged it into his back, below his left shoulder. That was the end. Louvini sank lifeless to the floor of the hut. Almost simultaneously the rear and roof of the structure burst into flames. I was almost naked, for he had torn nearly all my clothing from me in our struggles. Hanging upon the wall of the hut was this white burnous, the property, doubtless, of one of the murdered Arabs. I seized it, and throwing it about me ran into the village street. The huts were now all aflame, and the last of the natives was disappearing through the gateway. To my right was a section of palisade that had not yet been attacked by the flames. To escape into the jungle by the gateway would have meant running into the arms of my enemies, and so somehow I managed to scale the palisade and drop into the jungle unseen by any. I have had considerable difficulty eluding the various bands of blacks who escaped the village. A part of the time I have been hunting for the Waziri, and the balance I have had to remain in hiding. I was resting in the crotch of a tree, about half a mile from here, when I saw the light of this man's fire, and when I came to investigate I was almost stunned by joy to discover that I had, as I imagined, stumbled upon my Tarzan. It was Louvini's body, then, and not yours, that they buried," said Tarzan. "Yes," said Jane, "and it was this man who just escaped whom I saw run off into the jungle with Flora, and not you, as I believed." Flora Hawkes looked up suddenly. "And it must have been Esteban who came with the Waziri and stole the gold from us. He fooled our men, and he must have fooled the Waziri too." "He might have fooled anyone if he could deceive me," said Jane Clayton. "I should have discovered the deception in a few minutes, I have no doubt, but in the flickering light of the campfire, and influenced as I was by the great joy of seeing Lord Greystoke again, I believed quickly that which I wanted to believe." The ape-man ran his fingers through his thick shock of hair in a characteristic gesture of meditation. "I cannot understand how he fooled Yusla in broad daylight," he said with a shake of his head. "I can," said Jane. "He told him that he had suffered an injury to his head which had caused him to lose his memory, partially an explanation which accounted for many lapses in the man's interpretation of your personality." "He was a clever devil," commented the ape-man. "He was a devil, all right," said Flora. It was more than an hour later that the grasses at the riverbank suddenly parted and Jad Baljah emerged silently into their presence. Grasped in his jaws was a torn and bloody leopard skin which he brought and laid at the feet of his master. The ape-man picked the thing up and examined it, and then he scowled. "I believe Jad Baljah killed him after all," he said. "He probably resisted," said Jane Clayton, "in which event Jad Baljah could do nothing else in self-defense but slay him." "Do you suppose he ate him?" cried Flora Hawkes. drawing fearfully away from the beast. "No," said Tarzan, "he has not had time. In the morning we will follow the spoor and find his body. I should like to have the diamonds again." And then he told Jane the strange story connected with his acquisition of the great wealth represented by the little bag of stones. The following morning they set out in search of Esteban's corpse. The trail led through dense brush and thorns to the edge of the river farther downstream, and there it disappeared, and though the ape-man searched both sides of the river for a couple of miles above and below the point at which he had lost the spoor, he found no further sign of the Spaniard. There was blood along the tracks that Esteban had made, and blood upon the grasses at the river's brim. At last the ape-man returned to the two women. "That is the end of the man who would be Tarzan," he said. "Do you think he is dead?" asked Jane. "Yes, I am sure of it," said the ape-man. "From the blood I imagine that Jadbaljah mauled him, but that he managed to break away and get into the river. The fact that I can find no indication of his having reached the bank within a reasonable distance of this spot leads me to believe that he has been devoured by crocodiles." Again Flora Hawkes shuddered. "He was a wicked man," she said, "but I would not wish even the wickedest such a fate as that." The ape-man shrugged. "He brought it upon himself, and doubtless the world is better off without him." "It was my fault," said Flora. "It was my wickedness that brought him and the others here. I told them of what I had heard of the gold in the treasure vaults of Opar. It was my idea to come here and steal it, and to find a man who could impersonate Lord Greystoke. Because of my wickedness many men have died, and you, Lord Greystoke, and your lady have almost met your death. I do not dare to ask for forgiveness." Jane Clayton put her arm about the girl's shoulder. "Avarice has been the cause of many crimes since the world began," she said, "and when crime is invoked in its aid, it assumes its most repulsive aspect and brings most often its own punishment, as you, Flora, may well testify. For my part, one, forgive you. I imagine that you have learned your lesson." "You have paid a heavy price for your folly," said the ape-man. "You have been punished enough. We will take you to your friends who are on their way to the coast under escort of a friendly tribe. They cannot be far distant, for from the condition of the men when I saw them, long marches are beyond their physical powers." The girl dropped to her knees at his feet. "How can I thank you for your kindness?" she said. "But I would rather remain here in Africa with you and Lady Greystoke, and work for you and show by my loyalty that I can redeem the wrong I did you." Tarzan glanced at his wife questioningly, and Jane Clayton signified her assent to the girl's request. "Very well then," said the ape-man, "you may remain with us, Flora." "You will never regret it," said the girl. "I will work my fingers off for you." The three and Jadbaljah had been 3 days upon the march toward home when Tarzan, who was in the lead, paused and, raising his head, sniffed the jungle air. Then he turned to them with a smile. "My Waziri are disobedient," he said. "I sent them home, and yet here they are, coming toward us, directly away from home." A few minutes later they met the van of the Waziri, and great was the rejoicing of the blacks when they found both their master and mistress alive and unscathed. "And now that we have found you," said Tarzan after the greetings were over and innumerable questions had been asked and answered, "tell me what you did with the gold that you took from the camp of the Europeans." "We hid it, O Bwana, where you told us to hide it," replied Ursula. "I was not with you, Ursula," said the ape-man. "It was another who deceived Lady Greystoke, even as he deceived you, a bad man who impersonated Tarzan of the Apes so cleverly that it is no wonder that you were imposed upon." "Then it was not you who told us that your head had been injured, and that you could not remember the language of the Waziri?" demanded Ursula. "It was not. I said Tarzan, for my head has not been injured, and I remember well the language of my children." "Ah," cried Ursula, "then it was not our big Bwana who ran from Buto the rhinoceros." Tarzan laughed. "Did the other run from Buto?" "That he did," cried Ursula. "He ran in great terror." "I do not know that I blame him," said Tarzan, "for Buto is no pleasant playfellow." "But our big Bwana would not run from him," said Ursula, proudly. "Even if another than I hid the gold, it was you who dug the hole. Lead me to the spot then, Ursula." The Waziri constructed rude yet comfortable litters for the two white women, though Jane Clayton laughed at the idea that it was necessary that she be carried and insisted upon walking beside her bearers more often than she rode. Flora Hawkes, however weak and exhausted as she was, could not have proceeded far without being carried, and was glad of the presence of the brawny Waziri who bore her along the jungle trail so easily. It was a happy company that marched in buoyant spirits toward the spot where the Waziri had cached the gold for Esteban. The blacks were overflowing with good nature because they had found their master and their mistress, while the relief and joy of Tarzan and Jane were too deep for expression. When at last they came to the place beside the river where they had buried the gold, the Waziri, singing and laughing, commenced to dig for the treasure, but presently their singing ceased and their laughter was replaced by expressions of puzzled concern. For a while Tarzan watched them in silence, and then a slow smile overspread his countenance. "You must have buried it deep, Yusula," he said. The black scratched his head. "No, not so deep as this, Bwana," he cried. "I cannot understand it. We should have found the gold before this." "Are you sure you are looking in the right place?" asked Tarzan. "This is the exact spot," Bwana the black assured him, "but the gold is not here. Someone has removed it since we buried it." The Spaniard again, commented Tarzan. "He was a slick customer." "But he could not have taken it alone," said Yusula. "There were many ingots of it." "No," said Tarzan, "he could not, and yet it is not here." The Waziri and Tarzan searched carefully about the spot where the gold had been buried. But so clever had been the woodcraft of Awaza that he had obliterated even from the keen senses of the ape-man every vestige of the spoor that he and the Spaniard had made in carrying the gold from the old hiding place to the new. "It is gone," said the ape-man, "but I shall see that it does not get out of Africa," and he dispatched runners in various directions to notify the chiefs of the friendly tribes surrounding his domain to watch carefully every safari crossing their territory, and to let none pass who carried data. "That will stop them," he said after the runners had departed. That night, as they made their camp upon the trail toward home, the three whites were seated about a small fire with Jad Balja lying just behind the ape-man, who was examining the leopard skin that the golden lion had retrieved in his pursuit of the Spaniard, when Tarzan turned toward his wife. "You were right, Jane," he said. "The treasure vaults of Opar are not for me. This time I have lost not only the gold but a fabulous fortune in diamonds as well, beside risking that greatest of all treasures yourself." "Let the gold and the diamonds go, John," she said. "We have one another in Korak." "And a bloody leopard skin," he supplemented, with a mystery map painted upon it in blood. Jad Balja sniffed the hide and licked his chops in anticipation or retrospection which. With a cry of terror, the Spaniard dived into the river. Chapter 21. An Escape and a Capture. At sight of the true Tarzan, Esteban Miranda turned and fled blindly into the jungle. His heart was cold with terror as he rushed on in blind fear. He had no objective in mind. He did not know in what direction he was going. His only thought, the thought which dominated him, was based solely upon a desire to put as much distance as possible between himself and the ape-man, and so he blundered on, forcing his way through dense thickets of thorns that tore and lacerated his flesh until, at every step, he left a trail of blood behind him. At the river's edge, the thorns reached out and seized again, as they had several times before, the precious leopard skin to which he clung with almost the same tenacity as he clung to life itself. But this time the thorns would not leave go their hold, and as he struggled to tear it away from them, his eyes turned back in the direction from which he had come. He heard the sound of a great body moving rapidly through the thicket toward him, and an instant later saw the baleful glare of two gleaming, yellow-green spots of flame. With a stifled cry of terror, the Spaniard relinquished his hold upon the leopard skin, and wheeling, dived into the river. As the black waters closed above his head, Jad Balja came to the edge of the bank, and looked down upon the widening circles which marked the spot of his quarry's disappearance, for Esteban, who was a strong swimmer, struck boldly for the opposite side of the stream, keeping himself well submerged. For a moment the golden lion scanned the surface of the river, and then he turned and sniffed at the hide the Spaniard had been forced to leave behind, and grasping it in his jaws tore it from the thorns that held it, and carried it back to lay it at the feet of his master. Forced at last to come to the surface for air, the Spaniard arose amid a mass of tangled foliage and branches. For a moment he thought that he was lost, so tightly held was he by the entangling boughs, but presently he forced his way upward. And as his head appeared above the surface of the water amidst the foliage, he discovered that he had arisen directly beneath a fallen tree that was floating down the center of the stream. After considerable effort, he managed to draw himself up to the boughs and find a place astride the great bole, and thus he floated downstream in comparative safety. He breathed a deep sigh of relief as he realized with what comparative ease he had escaped the just vengeance of the ape-man. It is true that he bemoaned the loss of the hide which carried the map to the location of the hidden gold, but he still retained in his possession a far greater treasure, and as he thought of it his hands gloatingly fondled the bag of diamonds fastened to his loincloth. Yet, even though he possessed this great fortune in diamonds, his avaricious mind constantly returned to the golden ingots by the waterfall. "Awaza will get it," he muttered to himself. "I never trusted the black dog, and when he deserted me I knew well enough what his plans were." All night long Esteban Miranda floated downstream upon the fallen tree, seeing no sign of life, until shortly after daybreak he passed a native village upon the shore. It was the village of Obibi the cannibal, and at sight of the strange figure of the white giant floating down the stream upon the bole of a tree, the young woman who espied him raised a great hue and cry, until the population of the village lined the shore watching him pass. "It is a strange god," cried one. "It is the river devil," said the witch doctor. "He is a friend of mine. Now indeed shall we catch many fish if for each 10 that you catch you give one to me." "It is not the river devil," rumbled the deep voice of Obi the cannibal. "You are getting old," he said to the witch doctor, "and of late your medicine has been poor medicine. And now you tell me that Obibi's greatest enemy is the river devil. That is Tarzan of the apes. Obi knows him well." And in truth every cannibal chief in the vicinity knew Tarzan of the apes well and feared and hated him, for relentless had been the ape-man's war against them. "It is Tarzan of the apes," repeated Obi, "and he is in trouble. Perhaps it is our chance to capture him." He called his warriors about him, and presently 100 brawny young bucks started at a jog-trot down the trail that paralleled the river. For miles they followed the slowly moving tree which carried Esteban Miranda, until at last at a bend in the river the tree was caught in the outer circle of a slow-moving eddy, which carried it beneath the overhanging limbs of trees growing close to the river's edge. Cramped and chilled and hungry as he was, Esteban was glad of the opportunity to desert his craft and gain the shore. And so laboriously he drew himself up among the branches of the tree that momentarily offered him a haven of retreat from the river, and crawling to its stem lowered himself to the ground beneath, unconscious of the fact that in the grasses around him squatted 100 cannibal warriors. Leaning against the bole of the tree the Spaniard rested for a moment. He felt for the diamonds and found that they were safe. "I am a lucky devil," after all he said aloud, and almost simultaneously the 50 blacks arose about him and leaped upon him. So sudden was the attack, so overwhelming the force, that the Spaniard had no opportunity to defend himself against them, with the result that he was down and securely bound almost before he could realize what was happening to him. "Ah, Tarzan of the apes, I have you at last," gloated Obi the cannibal, but Esteban did not understand a word the man said, and so he could make no reply. He talked to Obibi in English, but that language the latter did not understand. Of only one thing was Esteban certain, that he was a prisoner and that he was being taken back toward the interior. When they reached Obi's village there was great rejoicing on the part of the women and the children and the warriors who had remained behind. But the witch doctor shook his head and made wry faces and dire prophecies. "You have seized the river devil," he said. "We shall catch no more fish, and presently a great sickness will fall upon Obibi's people and they will all die like flies." But Obibi only laughed at the witch doctor, for, being an old man and a great king, he had accumulated much wisdom, and, with the acquisition of wisdom, man is more inclined to be skeptical in matters of religion. "You may laugh now," Obibi said the witch doctor, "but later you will not laugh. Wait and see. When, with my own hands, I kill Tarzan of the apes, then indeed shall I laugh," replied the chief. "And when I and my warriors have eaten his heart and his flesh, then indeed shall we no longer fear any of your devils." "Wait," cried the witch doctor angrily, "and you shall see." They took the Spaniard, securely bound, and threw him into a filthy hut, through the doorway of which he could see the women of the village preparing cooking fires and pots for the feast of the coming night. A cold sweat stood out upon the brow of Esteban Miranda as he watched these gruesome preparations, the significance of which he could not misinterpret, when coupled with the gestures and the glances that were directed toward the hut where he lay by the inhabitants of the village. The afternoon was almost spent, and the Spaniard felt that he could count the hours of life remaining to him upon possibly 2 fingers of one hand, when there came from the direction of the river a series of piercing screams which shattered the quiet of the jungle, and brought the inhabitants of the village to startled attention, and an instant later sent them in a mad rush in the direction of the fear-laden shrieks. but they were too late and reached the river only just in time to see a woman dragged beneath the surface by a huge crocodile. "Ah, Obibi, what did I tell you?" demanded the witch doctor, exultantly. "Already has the devil god commenced his revenge upon your people." The ignorant villagers, steeped in superstition, looked fearfully from their witch doctor to their chief. Obibi scowled. "He is Tarzan of the apes," he insisted. "He is the river devil, who has taken the shape of Tarzan of the apes," insisted the witch doctor. "We shall see," replied Obibi. "If he is the river devil, he can escape our bonds. If he is Tarzan of the apes, he cannot. If he is the river devil, he will not die a natural death, like men die, but will live on forever. If he is Tarzan of the apes, someday he will die. We will keep him then and see. And that will prove whether or not he is Tarzan of the apes or the river devil." "How?" asked the witch doctor. "It is very simple," replied Obibi. "If some morning we find that he has escaped, we will know that he is the river devil, and because we have not harmed him but have fed him well while he has been here in our village, he will befriend us, and no harm will come of it. But if he does not escape, we will know that he is Tarzan of the apes, provided he dies a natural death. And so, if he does not escape, we shall keep him until he dies, and then we shall know that he was indeed Tarzan of the apes." "But suppose he does not die?" asked the witch doctor, scratching his woolly head. "Then," exclaimed Obibi triumphantly, "we will know that you are right, and that he was indeed the river devil." Obibi went and ordered women to take food to the Spaniard while the witch doctor stood where Obibi had left him, in the middle of the street, still scratching his head in thought. And thus was Esteban Miranda, possessor of the most fabulous fortune in diamonds that the world had ever known, condemned to life imprisonment in the village of Obi the cannibal. While he had been lying in the hut, his traitorous confederate, Owaza, from the opposite bank of the river, from the spot where he and Esteban had hidden the golden ingots, saw Tarzan and his waziri come and search for the gold and go away again. And the following morning Owaza came with 50 men whom he had recruited from a neighboring village and dug up the gold and started with it toward the coast. That night Owaza made camp just outside a tiny village of a minor chief who was weak in warriors. The old fellow invited Owaza into his compound, and there he fed him and gave him native beer. While the chief's people circulated among Owaza's boys, plying them with innumerable questions, until at last the truth leaked out and the chief knew that Owaza's porters were carrying a great store of yellow gold. When the chief learned this, for certain he was much perturbed, but finally a smile crossed his face as he talked with the half-drunken Owaza. "You have much gold with you," said the old chief, "and it is very heavy. It will be hard to get your boys to carry it all the way back to the coast." "Yes," said Owaza, "but I shall pay them well." "If they did not have to carry it so far from home, you would not have to pay them so much, would you?" asked the chief. "No," said Owaza, "but I cannot dispose of it this side of the coast." "I know where you can dispose of it within 2 days' march," replied the old chief. "Where?" demanded Owaza, "and who here in the interior will buy it?" "There is a white man who will give you a little piece of paper for it, and you can take that paper to the coast and get the full value of your gold." "Who is this white man?" demanded Owaza, "and where is he?" "He is a friend of mine," said the chief, "and if you wish I will take you to him on the morrow, and you can bring with you all your gold and get the little piece of paper." "Good," said Owaza, "and then I shall not have to pay the carriers but a very small amount." The carriers were glad indeed to learn the next day that they were not to go all the way to the coast, for even the lure of payment was not sufficient to overcome their dislike to so long a journey and their fear of being at so great a distance from home. They were very happy, therefore, as they set forth on a 2 days' march toward the northeast. And Owaza was happy, and so was the old chief, who accompanied them himself, though why he was happy about it Owaza could not guess. They had marched for almost 2 days when the chief sent one of his own men forward with a message. "It is to my friend," he said, "to tell him to come and meet us and lead us to his village." And a few hours later, as the little caravan emerged from the jungle onto a broad, grassy plain, they saw not far from them, and approaching rapidly, a large band of warriors. Owaza halted. "Who are those?" he demanded. "Those are the warriors of my friend," replied the chief, "and he is with them. See," and he pointed toward a figure at the head of the blacks, who were approaching at a trot, their spears and white plumes gleaming in the sunshine. "They come for war and not for peace," said Owaza tearfully. "That depends upon you," Owaza replied the chief. I do not understand you, said Owaza. But you will in a few minutes after my friend has come. As the advancing warriors approached more closely, Owaza saw a giant white at their head, a white whom he mistook for Esteban, the Confederate he had so traitorously deserted. He turned upon the chief. You have betrayed me, he cried. Wait, said the old chief, nothing that belongs to you shall be taken from you. The gold is not his, cried Owaza. He stole it, and he pointed at Tarzan, who had approached and halted before him, but who ignored him entirely and turned to the chief. Your runner came, he said to the old man, and brought your message, and Tarzan and his waziri have come to see what they could do for their old friend. The chief smiled. Your runner came to me, O Tarzan, 4 days since, and 2 days later came this man with his carriers, bearing golden ingots toward the coast. I told him that I had a friend who would buy them, giving him a little piece of paper for them, but that, of course, only in case the gold belonged to Owaza. The ape man smiled. You have done well, my friend, he said. The gold does not belong to Owaza. It does not belong to you either, cried Owaza. You are not Tarzan of the apes. I know you. You came with the 4 white men and the white woman to steal the gold from Tarzan's country, and then you stole it from your own friends. The chief and the waziri laughed. The ape man smiled one of his slow smiles. The other was an impostor. Owaza, he said, but I am Tarzan of the apes, and I thank you for bringing my gold to me. Come, he said, it is but a few more miles to my home, and the ape man compelled Owaza to direct his carriers to bear the golden ingots to the Greystoke bungalow. There Tarzan fed the carriers and paid them, and the next morning sent them back toward their own country, and he sent Owaza with them, but not without a gift of value, accompanied with an admonition that the black never again return to Tarzan's country. When they had all departed, and Tarzan and Jane and Korak were standing upon the veranda of the bungalow with Jadbal Jah lying at their feet, the ape man threw an arm about his mate's shoulders. I shall have to retract what I said about the gold of Opar not being for me, for you see before you a new fortune that has come all the way from the treasure vaults of Opar without any effort on my part. Now, if someone would only bring your diamonds back, laughed Jane. No chance of that, said Tarzan. They are unquestionably at the bottom of the Ugogo River. And far away, upon the banks of the Ugogo, in the village of Obibi, the cannibal, Esteban Miranda lay in the filth of the hut that had been assigned to him, gloating over the fortune that he could never utilize as he entered upon a life of captivity that the stubbornness and superstition of Obibi had doomed him to undergo. End of Tarzan and the Golden Lion. Best audiobooks for free. Hope that you have enjoyed this production of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan and the Golden Lion. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content.